In November, the New York Times' Alan Foyer wrote about a 400-mile drive on Alaska's Dalton Highway, which he calls one of America's loneliest roads.
As I mentioned in the story, my girlfriend of the last 3 years went off on an adventure in Europe for the summer, and I had found myself in a state of distraction when she left that I didn't quite expect, to the point where I was picking up books and putting them down. I was trying to watch Netflix, and it just wasn't working, and I wondered what the hell was really going wrong with me, that I couldn't work right, and I just felt off in a very sort of, profound but ultimately unimportant way. But it was definitely present. And so when I really thought about it, I realized that I had not been on my own for more than, like a week or something like that, here or there, in nigh on 20 years. I had been married, I'd lived with various people, and now suddenly I was facing the entire season, which was that summer, totally by myself. And it freaked me out for a second that I was reacting like this. And I thought, what the hell is that all about? And so I didn't like that reaction, and I decided, well, if, a little bit of solitude in my own home for 3 months is going to rob me of my concentration and focus, well, fuck that. And so I literally went to Google and typed the words loneliest road in America into, the search bar. And as I mentioned, up came US 50 in Nevada. I'd already been there. And then I started reading about the Dalton. And I thought, okay, so I need to go someplace that's sort of profoundly lonely, just to sort of get back in touch with that part of myself. Because one of the ironies that I didn't really have time or space to mention in the story is that 15, 20 years ago, I loved nothing better than to be alone. When I was 19, I dropped out of college, and I'd spent almost 2 years traveling completely by myself. I went all across the world, and I kept journals from those days, and I reread them before I went on the Dalton, and it was all about how thrilled and just full of joy I was to be totally by myself. And I thought that was some part of myself that I really wanted to reclaim. It just seemed important to me in some inchoate but fundamental way. That's why I convinced the Times travel section to pay me to go up to Alaska. Alaskan highway just sort of comes to an end with an unimpressive sign announcing your arrival at the Dalton Highway, at which point the pavement stops, and for the next 416 odd miles, you're driving on a combination of dirt and gravel with the occasional potholed pavement. And the road travels through some of Alaska's wildest and most pristine country. It goes through a sort of boreal forest of spruce trees, which is, glorious and green. It then ascends very rapidly in a series of switchbacks up the Brooks mountain range to an altitude of around about a mile. So, like Denver altitude. And then on the backside of the Brooks Range, you enter this very Tolkien-esque, misty coastal plain that's all sort of fog and tundra and vast swaths of flatness. And that finally leads to the Arctic Ocean and this sort of massive petrochemical industrial complex in the town of Deadhorse. And the road itself is really the only marker of civilization throughout this gigantic, undeveloped patch of Alaska, and is shadowed by the Alaskan pipeline. This stretch of unserviced highway on the North American continent, which means the northern segment of the Dalton leaves you without gasoline, leaves you without food, water, flush toilets, cell phone service, police protection, hospitals, internet, even radio. there's absolutely nothing out there. And should you find yourself, with engine failure or a cracked windshield or a flat tire, you're more or less on your own, but for the good graces of the local trucking population, should they indeed decide to stop and help you out.
At one point you said, all that I had with me was a bag of clothes, some water, cheese and trail mix, and a vague belief that if I was alone, it might as well be very alone and on the road. What was that belief about, and why push yourself to be very alone, if alone at all?
I guess it's because as I felt my own discomfort with solitude now, and I looked back at this sort of intoxication to solitude, when I was in my 20s, I'm now 44, I felt it as sort of a loss of self in some way, because I think that, as I read what I had written in my early 20s, it was very clear to me in an almost embarrassing way how full of self I was. I was both sort of full of myself, but also just sort of full of self, to the point where there was so much me bursting out at 20 years old that there was no possibility of being lonely, because I filled all the space around me. And so the idea of being in a vast emptiness was actually appealing to me at that point. And I looked back at myself now and I thought, well, over the course of when you basically 2 decades pass and some combination of the self starts to diminish in intensity, but also you get a grasp that the world is sort of much larger than you had once expected. And I felt it as a sort of diminution in a way that I didn't particularly like. And so that's why I went about trying to go back to that state of sort of ripeness and bursting out at the seams. And I thought just to put myself back in that position would be just a good and healthy corrective.
Did you find yourself in any really strange headspaces during that trip? I mean, did you?
Yeah, I started singing to myself at one point just to sort of cut through the boredom. But the headspace that I found sort of most fruitful was completely forgetting about the fact that I was by myself, which was kind of what I was hoping for.
Right.
Because I think the idea is that the experience of loneliness is being conscious of being alone, right? There's no way to feel loneliness without dwelling on the fact that you are by yourself. Whereas the idea of solitude, I think, is a kind of innocence of your solitariness, where you're not even necessarily quite aware of being alone because, you are occupying yourself as much physically, I suppose, as mentally. And so there were definitely times where the aloneness was just sort of merged into the trip itself. There was sort of no distinction between me and the trip that I was taking, which was kind of what I was hoping for.
Yahoo Travel editor-at-large Paula Froelich loves to travel by herself, and you can see this on her adventure travel web series, Abroad.
You know what it's about? You give yourself a hot minute of reflection. You look back at what happened in the last year, and you say, all right, what did I learn from that? And what am I going to do going forward? And how do I want to be? Like, what things do I want to toss out the window? And what things do I want to nurture or keep? And, it's hard to do that when you're surrounded by a bunch of people and you're hungover.
I know that you, because you're filming all of this, are not alone a lot of the time, but you are depicting an experience as a lone traveler. So what was that decision about? Why do that as opposed to a crew of people?
Well, here's the deal. I quit my job. I've had a couple jobs that I have where from the outside they look amazing, and from the inside you're just like, what is wrong with me? One of those jobs was page 6 at the New York Post, which to this day people are like, I can't believe you left. And I was like, it's not what I wanted to do. I just wasn't happy. I love the post. I love page 6. They deserve somebody who wanted to be there. So I quit and I started traveling. And before I quit, I'd been on Entertainment Tonight and The Insider and doing things like, so what are you wearing? Being like, i.e., what did your stylist pick out for you? You know, how was it working with X famous actor? Oh, wait, let me fill in the answer for you. So I had some TV experience, but I was traveling around and I was a contributing editor for Playboy. I went to Iraq on a bus tour for a big cover piece I did for them. I did Vietnam, and I did some, more conventional places. And what I started seeing was not being reflected anywhere. It was what I started seeing was women over the age of 40 were traveling, and they were traveling solo, whether they were married or not. And I was like, it's like I wrote a piece about it for Newsweek in which I said, single independent women are the new gay men. The theory behind that is back in the 90s, advertisers started realizing there's this group of people out there. They can't get married. They don't have kids, have expendable income, a lot of it. And they like really, really nice things.
Right.
So then, of course, there were a few miscues. Logo at first was just Priscilla, Queen of the Desert on a loop for 2 years. But then they actually went after the gay male market. And I looked around and I was like, you know what? Women over a certain age, either divorced or their kids are out of college or off in college, or their husband's here, but they just, they're independent. And I don't know if you know this, but women get more independent as they get older and men get more codependent. And they like nice things. They've got expendable money because right now women can accumulate more than men. Single women actually make more than men. And nobody's talking to us. So I went around to a bunch of places and I was like, we should do this. And I got some really crazy responses from media companies. I was like, here's the numbers. Here's what I'm seeing. And they're like, yeah, Paula, but you're from New York. People in the flyover states don't do that. And I was like, actually, I'm from Ohio and Kentucky. And they would say stuff like, women don't travel alone. They need a buddy. And I'm like, what? But I see this all the time. So I created it with Abroad, and then I got hired by Yahoo. And at the time, Yahoo Travel was really primarily a booking site. And I came in and made it full editorial. And apparently it really stuck with people because within 4 or 5 months, we became the biggest content site in the world. The old school way of thinking of it is, hashtag, you must be such a loser.
To be traveling alone, you mean?
Yeah, or doing anything alone. Oh, look, she's eating in a restaurant alone. I once had somebody look at me back in the early 2000s visiting LA. And there was this publicist. She goes, what are you doing tonight? And I go, I'm going to go to this restaurant. And she was like, oh, my God, that just opened. It's so great. Who are you going with? And I go, just myself. And she goes, wow. I could never. I would just feel like such a loser. And I was like, thanks. Yeah, no, I'm down. We're good. Thanks.
Well, so you very much like your alone time, it sounds like, and you're comfortable with it.
I am and I'm not. Like the first trip I ever did alone, I thought I was going to die of shame and mortification. And by the way, even now sometimes I'll be like, should I just stay in my room? And I literally have to just be like, put your big girl panties on. You'll know when you're coming back to this place, and you should go check it out.
What is that about when you think about wanting to stay in your room? Is it social anxiety, or is it depression, or you just want to sleep because you're busy a lot? What is that?
It's a mix of the above. And it's also, there's a side of me I call the dancing monkey. As you can attest, I'm awesome at a dinner party. But it's exhausting to keep people entertained. I was raised of the old school of, if you're invited, you are supposed to do your part, and your part is to make conversation. If I'm a great conversationalist, but it's exhausting. And when you're alone, especially in some countries where if you're alone, you are a hooker, like Italy, it's not that easy. Sometimes even like in Mexico City, I was like, I'm exhausted. I'm going to give myself the gift of sleep for a hot minute. I'm going to give myself the gift of just reflection because I love that. And then I'm going to figure something out. And, when I say I travel alone, I'm a travel evangelist. I think everyone's better off if they get up off their butts, get out of an office especially, and go somewhere and do something. alone. Of course, people also go, so do you ever hook up on these trips? And I'm like, no, I don't. First of all, none of your business. Second of all, I don't because that's my job and I don't want to be unprofessional. But third of all, most important, that would defeat the entire purpose. The point of the matter is, loneliness is a deep, dark fear. And unless you cast a light on something and shine on the dark corners, it just gets bigger. I was talking to the travel writer yesterday, and he wanted to start a website about the first time people traveled alone. And he goes, the first trip I traveled alone, I cried every day and cut it short because I was just so miserable. And then on the trips, I met this woman in Mali in West Africa. At first, I thought I was going to hate her. This is another lesson you learn. Snap judgments are bullshit. The snap judgments of like, oh, God, look, this person's a hippie. I was raised to not like hippies, okay? It's a Ohio, Kentucky thing. And, Sue's looked like a hippie. And we get off in Bamako, and I see her at the airport. She's like, hey, man, how's it going? And I was like, oh, Jesus Christ, right? Mm-hmm. And then I was like, shut up. You're going to be with this woman for 3 weeks. Turns out she's still one of my best friends. She was 62 at the time. And she was a shrink for the Army in San Diego. And we just, we started talking. And I was like, so you're married? She had like a ring on every finger. She goes, no, I did that once. I don't need to again. And I was like, so are you dating anyone? She goes, yeah, I got my honey, Jim. And I'm like, yeah. And she goes, oh, we've been together like 10 years. And I go, wow, well, why isn't he here? And she goes, oh, my Lord, not his thing. And I was like, why are you here? And she goes, I always wanted to see Timbuktu. I'm of a certain age. I give myself one big trip a year to do what I always wanted to do. And you can sense a theme. I've taken a lot from Suze. And she goes, and I always wanted to see Timbuktu. And you know what? If he was here, I'd be miserable. He'd be trying to have a good time because he'd want me to have a good time. But I would know he's not really having a good time because it's not his thing. And I'd always be watching him out of the corner of my eye. And right now, I'm having the time of my life.
Randall Reeves plans to circumnavigate both the Americas and the Antarctic in a small sailboat starting in September 2017. He's going to do this alone, and it's called single-handing.
A sailor who's a single-hander is not a sailor without a left arm. He's a guy or a gal who sails the boat by him or herself. In sailing world, a hand is a crew member. So a single-hander is a guy with one crew member, i.e. himself. It's funny, I've been attracted to it since I can remember. My father was a merchant marine, although he'd come ashore by the time I was born. And he had sailing lore all over the house, a sextant, his uniforms, his medals, really cool navigation books. And so I was attracted to the ocean from a very early age. But we didn't get a sailboat until I was in high school. And I remember specifically the feeling that first day on the river. We lived up the river, up above San Francisco, about 80 miles. So it was all river sailing when I was young. And I remember that feeling of the wind and the sails and the boat heeling over and charging off and thinking to myself, wow, this is what I was made for. Single-handers oftentimes will talk about the loneliness and combating the loneliness and things like that. The times that I've been out to sea, I have, for the most part, really felt connected to the boat, connected to the ocean. There's wonderful bird life in some sections of the ocean. So seeing these great albatrosses fly close to the boat, or having the gadfly petrels play in the wind vortexes behind the sails, seeing the marine life when there is marine life. The variation of waves and wind and clouds from one day to the next, they all feel like friends.
It takes a certain kind to be able to plug into that,
yeah,
and to feel companionship, from those things, from nature, as opposed to feeling the loss of companionship because you're the only human there. So I wonder if there are any personality traits, certainly that you and single-handers share at large. Do you think?
Well, being single-handers, we don't necessarily know each other.
Right.
a bunch of loners for the most part. But
So it's not like
it is
hikers,
kind of
who go off on their own and then you're meeting them along the trail here and there, and there's a certain kind of, it's sort of lampposted by these little bits of community. I mean, single-handers, you're really out there alone the whole time, I guess.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, so it's not really much of a community. But I have met some people, and yes, I think part of what we tend to share is kind of classic introversion. One might even call it, from a certain perspective, a kind of painful introversion. If you were to compare me to my wife, for example, who doesn't really understand the idea of having too many friends, or has never met a party she didn't like. Compare that to me. I have 2 friends, and I kind of think I need to thin the ranks a little bit. I have too many. It's just a different approach. She is an extrovert, and she's charged. Her batteries are recharged when she spends time with people. And my batteries, I feel, are recharged when I am spending time alone. So there's this kind of joy in solitude. Aloneness doesn't mean loneliness for me necessarily. It means solitude, a kind of reconnecting, a rejuvenation, a kind of getting in contact with one's own self and one's own feelings.
If we take your most recent voyage, which covered 12,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean, you completed it over 3 passages and each took about a month. So it's a month on your own each time. Do you ever really dip down into loneliness? And if so, how do you deal with that or combat it, or do you relish in it, or?
No, I certainly don't relish in it. Yes, absolutely. I have felt loneliness. If by loneliness we mean kind of a fatigue of the current condition, and a wish to kind of jump out of it. So I oftentimes am loneliest just before I start. One of the most frightening times of any particular passage is like that day before you're supposed to weigh anchor and go. And the whole the kind of the immensity of what you're trying to do can come crashing in, and you just. I remember when I left Honolulu, Hawaii, shooting up to Alaska. I was going to go through the North Pacific, which can be a very rough place, and Honolulu Bay, next to the town of Honolulu, is lovely, tropical, lush, lots of nice people and interesting bars to hang out in. And I just remember thinking, well, I'm leaving all of this comfort, this wonderful floral, tropical surroundings, and I'm headed out into that. And it was terrible. It was just, I actually delayed for 3 days because the weather wasn't quite right. I would tell Joanna, no, I can't leave today. It's a little too windy. But I have always found that once I've started, once I weigh anchor and get out of the ocean and the boat begins to move in the sea, and I begin to realize that the boat is doing what it's made for and that it knows what it's doing, and as long as I can keep it pointed in the right direction and stay on board, everything will be great. Then I start to kind of unwind a bit and really enjoy the passage. And that usually lasts until I'm almost there. I remember coming into Hawaii from Tahiti. I landed in the Big Island, and the Big Island has a huge mountain, Mauna Loa, right in the middle, 14,000 feet. You can see it for miles at sea. And I could see it for 3 days before I actually made port. It was the most painful 3 days because I just wanted to be there already. The passage felt like it was over, but the wind had died, and I couldn't actually get the boat into harbor. There have been other moments of loneliness. Oddly enough, kind of in association, very loosely with other people. When I left Hawaii to go up to Alaska, I had to go through the tsunami debris zone. This was in 2012, and in 2011, you'll remember there was a giant tsunami that hit Japan, pulled off something in the order of 1.5 trillion tons of stuff from the island, which very slowly had been floating toward the east, toward Hawaii, and then toward the U.S. I had to go through that. And I was kind of freaked out. No one knew quite where it was or quite what it was. We saw pictures of, upended ships and floating houses and stuff like that. And I never saw any of that. But what I saw were people's personal effects, hairbrushes, toothbrushes, desks, tables, chairs, shoes, Kind of the common story was when those shoes left Japan, they had people's feet in them.
Oh, yeah.
So it was a little bit gruesome and kind of lonely in the sense that I was with the society of people's things, as it were, but the people had been taken. It was a very eerie part of the trip.
What do you do to get over those feelings, or is it just time and sort of onward and there are tasks at hand that take you away?
Yeah, it's mostly routine. If you read through the sailing literature, what one common theme is that sailors love routine because there's lots of the sameness, right? It's the same ocean, it's the same skies, the same clouds, same waves every day. And in my case, I tend to, when I'm really enjoying it, I'll zone out. I just love watching what's going on. Yeah. So I have to set a schedule. There's plenty to do. There's cooking and cleaning and navigating and setting sail and changing course and all kinds of stuff like that. But I have to regiment myself. Otherwise, either when I'm enjoying it, I'll just spend the day gawking, or when I'm not enjoying it, it really can get you down. The passage north from Hawaii to Alaska got very cold, and I had forgotten in my 2 years in the tropics, I didn't have much in the way of warm clothing on the boat, so I got really, really cold. Way up north, it got down to mid-30s, and
wow.
And that was rain in mid-30s, and being cold for weeks on end, that can get you down. So staying connected to what you're doing, making sure that the boat is seaworthy, making sure she's going in the right direction. And writing. I have the privilege of being able to post logs from sea, and so I've made a habit of writing every day, not just where I am and what speed I'm going, but also kind of how I'm feeling and what the day is like and things like that. And that really, I enjoy that a lot, and it really helps keep me connected.
We talked about some of your low moments at sea. I want to talk about some of the high moments as well, and particularly the high moments that kind of can only come from it being you and the sea, right? I mean, you have mentioned in some of your writings on the blog that part of the thrill of these trips is that it's almost more rewarding to be out there on your own and looking at the entire ocean with just you in front of it than seeing it with somebody by your side. I mean, would you say that's true, and if so, why?
Part of it is I love practicing self-reliance, and so knowing how to do everything, knowing how to take care of myself on the boat is very rewarding. And I think part of it is just sheer selfishness. I like to do all that, and I don't like to share those activities. And then part of it goes back to the feelings of solitude, and when I'm out there on my own, seeing the spectacular natural world and its changes from day to day, it's just thrilling. I have all kinds of specific memories. I remember one day I was sailing north to north to Hawaii from Bora Bora, and in the morning there was just this amazingly tall and long cloud bank. It was from one horizon to the other, and it seemed like thousands of feet high. Just took up the entire western sky. And I sailed along this wall of cloud all day long, and then had to sail through it and realized it was a big, I don't know how this could be, but it was just this big circle of cloud. I sailed through a clear center and out the other side, and just as I came out the other side, this giant frigate bird came shooting out of the cloud as well. And that's one little regular moment in all kinds of, you're looking at a world that possibly nobody else has seen before. You're going to places possibly nobody else has ever been, and seeing all kinds of fantastic things. Sailing at night one time in the middle of the ocean where there are no islands and where the sea bottom is a mile or so below you. I remember in the moonlight, I could see a disturbance on the water ahead of me that looked like rocks. Extremely frightening. Hitting rocks in the middle of the ocean would be very bad. But logically it was impossible because I was in an area of the ocean where there was just no land, but it looked like rocks. And it was too late in my approach to this thing that looked like rocks for me to change course. I went right through the middle of these two odd shapes, which were whales. out in the middle of nowhere. And I remember distinctly looking over the side of the boat. I was sitting in the cockpit, looking over the side of the boat to the right at one whale that, as I went by, rolled over and gave me an eye, and then rolled over again and was gone. And it's just, you get hundreds of little moments like that where you just really feel like you're seeing something intimate and special.
So your next trip, let's talk about this. You're calling it the Figure 8 Voyage. It's going to start in September 2017. You're going to be circumnavigating both the Americas and the Antarctic in a small sailboat, passing through 4 separate oceans and nearing both poles in the process. So all told, you're going to sail 40,000 miles over a year. Why? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the why,
Sure.
why you do this in general, but this particular challenge, how did you dream it up?
It's a funny question, partly because of my reaction to it, which is just indicative of where I come from. Somebody asks me why, I think to myself, well, given time and money, wouldn't anyone want to do this? And my wife, Joanna, has to remind me that no, she says, you're the only person I've ever met who wants to do something like that. For me, so my 2 years in the Pacific were just amazing. I loved the long passages. I loved learning how to do a long passage, you don't just go from Tahiti to Hawaii straight. You have to sail it, and you have to go through the doldrums where there's no wind, and you have to think your way through heavy weather, and you have to navigate. I taught myself how to use a sextant, the old-fashioned celestial navigation on my and enjoyed that. But that trip was all what we call middle latitude sailing. It was mostly tropical stuff, which is great, but it isn't the real heavy-duty challenge that a lot of single-handers are looking for. The Figure 8 will leave San Francisco in 2017 and head south and into the Southern Ocean. So if you were to hold a globe in your hand and turn it upside down and look straight down at Antarctica, you'd see that between the bottom of the continents of South America, Africa, and Australia and Antarctica is a really big body of water. It's a big donut around that continent of Antarctica, which is called the Southern Ocean. Winds tend to blow in a clockwise direction around that ocean and very fast. In the winter, the hurricane force winds are very common. In the summertime is like December. In the summertime, winds average 25 to 35, 40 knots. 40 miles an hour, really a lot of wind. And because there's no land to interrupt that wind passage, the waves get very large. It's serious sailing. The Southern Ocean is considered the Mount Everest of sailing. One could say that it's attractive partly because it's never been done. Sailors have gone through the Northwest Passage. Sailors have gone around the Southern Ocean. Single-handers have done one or the other. But nobody's tried to do the 2 passages in one go, in one season, and that's the attempt, is to do this in 1 year, to time it such that I'm in the south in the summer, in the north in the summer, is really challenging. So that's part of it, but really the attraction for me is having done some serious sailing in the Pacific, having, as it were, gotten my feet wet. I'm really attracted to what we call the high latitudes, far north and far south. There's a certain albatross that lives in the Southern Ocean and spends its life going around and around and around. It's called the wandering albatross. And it sails and swims and it flies constantly. It can even sleep on the wing in this environment where waves are 40 feet. Waves can be, in the wintertime, 100 feet. It lives as if it's in its own backyard. I just think there's something thrilling about being able to go to a place like the Southern Ocean and see that. That just really makes my heart beat.
Are you a wandering albatross?
Do
you identify with this animal?
I definitely identify with that. Being able to live easily and handily in what many people, myself included, look at as just an incredibly hostile environment. I just admire that.
Thanks for joining us on this first ever episode of The Lonely Hour. For more, head to thelonelyhour.com. This is The Lonely Hour, produced by Pale Groove. Before I get into today's topic and interviews, I want to tell you what exactly we're doing here. I'm your host, Julia Bainbridge. I'm an editor and a writer, mainly about food, but I also have a lot of feelings, loneliness being one of them. I want to explore that feeling because it's pervasive, but the literature on it is not. Each episode of The Lonely Hour is going to focus on a particular topic, whether it's a community or a profession, an age group, or an activity that seems to arouse feelings of loneliness or aloneness. That could be mental illness, for example. Or it could be social media's effect on us. It could even be motherhood. The idea is to catalog tidbits on this very human feeling. Because we all feel lonely sometimes, I want to explore how we feel it. A lot's been written about social media and loneliness. The idea that, as one Huffington Post writer put it, technology has distracted us from the age-old truths of what is most important, true friends whom we can be ourselves in front of, rather than our carefully scripted online persona. I want to find out if this quote rings true for a number of people who are heavily involved in the social media world, starting with Patrick Janelle, also known as a guy named Patrick on Instagram. Patrick has amassed 450,000 followers on Instagram and has found a way to make a career out of his social media self. He received the first ever CFDA award for Fashion Instagrammer of the Year.
I think that it is very easy to see how perception of somebody changes drastically because of social media. So it may not be that somebody is affected in their personal relationships as much as those around that person tend to think differently of who that person really is. I may be the same person whether or not I have social media, but a larger perception of me changes because of the way that I present myself. Of course, I'm not going to show my kind of deepest, darkest moments on my personal social media. That's certainly not how I present myself within my world of social media. So the perception may be that that just doesn't exist.
Right. I'm thinking, obviously it is a huge topic, as you said, and maybe one recent story to look at that might help us enter into this topic is that this 18-year-old blogger from Australia, did you hear about this?
I didn't.
Senna O'Neill. She had over 250,000 YouTube and Tumblr subscribers, 60,000 Snapchat followers, and over 500,000 Instagram followers, and she was paid a lot of money to promote clothes and swimwear and health drinks, but she removed most of it from the internet recently, saying, without realizing, I've spent the majority of my teenage life being addicted to social media, social approval, social status, and physical appearance. So I wonder about that need for social approval that this kind of media bred in her was alienating, and she decided to go kind of, quote unquote, live her life. If that
I think that,
yeah,
I mean, I think that it can be alienating. The fact that, especially when somebody gets to a point in which, one, so much attention is put on you publicly, and you're also constantly bombarded with people who want to be a part of that attention, working with brands, like you're making money because brands want to be part of the attention that somebody's getting. Ultimately, like, a majority of your mind is taken up with thinking about all of those things. And so even if the elements of how you view yourself and like your own self-esteem and like public approval, even if those aren't the things that you actually care most deeply about, it's what you end up focusing on so much of your time, because it's like what's driving your financial situation. It's what's driving your work and your creativity. Of course, like it's very easy, I think, for those things to have detrimental effect.
I mean, in this girl's case, she's now 18 at the time that she's been engaged on all of these platforms for 5 or so years. I mean, she became, quote, famous at 14 through these platforms. So she has very much grown up with these, always having been in existence. You've lived a life before and after the existence of social media. So you've been able to use it as a professional tool without being your life. You know, it's
it is my life, but I also, I mean, I think that I'm glad that you brought up that point, that I sort of existed before social media. Wow, that's amazing. But it's totally true that I definitely see social media as an extension and a fun creative tool and outlet for broadening the audience to my creativity, which is awesome. But I also totally understand in my wise old age at nearly 34, especially in digital years, I feel that I have a really good sense of what the value is that these things represent within my life. And certainly right now for me, fortunately, like social media represents a huge value financially. It's, it's my job. While that job is so intertwined with my daily life, I also understand that whatever I portray on social media and whatever perception of me is not as important as who I actually am in my day-to-day life and who I am like with my friends and with my family and just to myself.
Right. What about, there's been some talk of the truth or the lack of truth on things like Instagram because you, me, lots of people will take 20 iPhone photos before settling on one worthy of posting, and even then we use up to 3 editing tools, and if you can expand on that.
Yeah, sure. Like I will spend a lot of time capturing one image to post to Instagram and captioning it with something maybe very quotidian, like hanging out with such and such a friend, catching up over coffee. And of course, yeah, maybe I spent several minutes taking many photos trying to get the perfect one to showcase what that was like. The thing that's interesting is that the reason that I do that is I actually have a vision in my mind of what's happening. The experience that I'm having is actually really beautiful. But if I'm just to like take out my iPhone and snap something, like the iPhone will capture it in a way that's not particularly beautiful because it's you're distilling that moment down to like a second that you can inspect every single element of what's going on. You can see the crack in the table that you might not have noticed just sitting there. And for me, it's about being able to capture an image that represents how I experienced the moment.
Right.
Even if it's
and you're not
not
necessarily a reporter
right
through Instagram. You are. This is a magazine in a way.
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
is an aspirational place that people have landed in when they go to your account.
I totally think so. And in the way, I mean, the idea, the comparison to a magazine, I think is really accurate. We both come from editorial worlds in which we understand how much work goes into one shot for an opener for a story. And in order to capture something beautifully that's compelling to somebody, you might have to go through more work, and there might have to be setup, and there might have to be thinking about what materials were used and what props were used and all of these things. I don't necessarily think that that's less authentic or less real. It is, in some ways, a heightened version of reality, and it is also, by excluding some of the details, I don't think that something becomes inauthentic. It's just showcasing a certain side of.
But it can inspire depression and disappointment in the lives of people who aren't living as well edited,
I never want anybody to think that, like, my life is just so perfect. Like, I would hope that many people out there would realize, maybe I'm slightly naive, that I think that everybody realizes that there is some effort that goes into taking, like, a beautiful photograph. I certainly in no way wish to project that everything is just sort of, like, nonchalantly thrown up on Instagram and it's immediately perfect. I would love for people to know that, like, sure, I actually take some time and effort to, like, capture beautifully the moments that I'm having. So,
right. Well, and of course, it's not your job to worry about the possible depression that might come from an average viewer's, feelings about your images. It's just an interesting thing to talk about in this time when we're all on these platforms and how it might be affecting us at large, as much as we hate making sweeping generalizations.
For sure. Well, I went through my own period of time when I was living in Germany, just kind of doing my freelance graphic design jobs with my partner at the time. And I was watching many friends who I knew from school and from other work that I had done previously who were kind of flourishing in creative communities online. Flickr was really big at the time, so a lot of people were kind of gaining followings and becoming parts of communities through the world of Flickr. Concurrently with Twitter was young, and people were really starting to build communities and friendships through Twitter. And I was seeing a lot of my friends grow their own creative ambitions through those communities, and I was like kind of sitting watching. And it was interesting because I didn't necessarily feel like anything was not true about what anybody else was doing, but I also felt like I was slightly sad that I didn't have anything to contribute, or that I wasn't really part of those conversations. And what it boiled down to for me is Instagram actually really makes sense for me just as a medium. Twitter never really did. Like, I'm not as much of a words person as I am a visual person. I spent a good bit of time not being depressed for sure, but definitely I think there was like a lonely feeling attached to being sort of outside of that community of people that I felt were really flourishing. Of course, being so happy for my friends who were doing something great, but being saddened by the fact that none of that really made sense to me in a way that I felt like I could kind of use those platforms to showcase my creativity.
Did it take Instagram coming around and you discovering that this was your platform to get out of that feeling of loneliness, or was there another way in which it wore off? Or
yeah, the interesting thing was I was also living in Germany in a different culture where I was also isolated by language and somewhat culture. I knew plenty of people that spoke English, but, you know, there still was a huge divide between me and the people that were around me because of language. So I think that all of those things kind of contributed to what I was feeling. At the same time that I basically joined Instagram a couple months after I moved to New York City. So I was suddenly like back physically in a community of people that I could communicate with more easily, and was in a place where I felt with ambition I could create a community of people that I could identify with and sort of flourish together with, while at the same time developing a digital life and persona and community on Instagram. And so I think it actually was the two things together. It wasn't just the medium of Instagram being great for me, it was also my physical surrounding.
do you get lonely ever?
Yeah, I do. To be honest, I think that a lot of the amount of things that I do and the amount of projects that I take on and my willingness to just be working all the time and pursue all of my projects in some ways is a way for me to kind of ignore what life would be like if I weren't busy all the time. The moment that I feel like, oh, I've kind of accomplished everything for like the moment, I don't have anything that's like super pressing and I can just sit at home by myself, I've suddenly become lonely and a little sad. And I think that a lot of the things I do are kind of diversions just within life. I love doing them all. I love Spring Street Social Society. I love Instagramming. I love building a brand. I love being strategic about the way that I'm using social media. I love the company that I'm building with my brothers, the Liquor Cabinet. All of those things I really love and enjoy. I notice in the moments when I'm not busy and when I'm not doing something, immediately I'm left with nothing but myself, and that's lonely.
Molly Guy uses all the social media platforms at her fingertips to promote her bridal showroom, Stone Fox Bride. Doing so helps her business, but it might also do other things.
I think we live in a really annoying time, and I become annoyed with myself for being right smack dab in the middle of it, I have to say.
How do you mean, how is it an annoying time?
A big part of my business and my quote-unquote success is about creating sort of this like culture or this idea or this image of this certain way of life. And a lot of that is done through visuals, and a lot of it's done through writing, and a lot of it's done through the people that get married and go kind of like spread the love, like our branding and our messaging. And that's great. I feel really good about that professionally. But I think that I didn't come of age in a time where I could look at my phone and see what everyone else was doing, or the images of themselves that they were projecting, and that kind of ambassadorship of perfection that we're all putting forth on social media. Listen, if you're picking up your phone and scrolling through Instagram, you're just as culpable as the person who's posting the picture.
Right.
It's like when I was a kid, I was an irate feminist when I was 15 years old, but I didn't have to be reading the fashion magazines and blaming Kate Moss for my eating disorder. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But when I was growing up, the world of fashion and media and Hollywood was really impenetrable, which is what made it special. Like, we didn't know how it existed or who celebrities were or what they ate. They just were sort of these, like, you know, larger than life creatures. And there was something about the fact that they were unattainable that made them so sexy. And now everyone's attainable. I think the cover of the style section yesterday was about, like, Kate Hudson's celebrity and how the reason why she's so famous is because she pretends she's so not famous, or she's so real, or she's so regular.
Mm-hmm.
What's real is, you know, what's real, and should I stop talking again? I'm sorry.
Nah, let's just roll through this one.
Intimacy has not, like, intimacy, the world of social media is not an intimate world. It's not a world that encourages us to get intimate with ourselves or with other people. And I think that's where relationships and love really live, in intimacy and discomfort and growth. I think that's where it happens.
What about, so you mean in intimacy and discomfort, those two things together?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discomfort in intimacy.
Interesting. How have you experienced that?
I don't know. When I look back at times of my life where I have felt really vulnerable in an intimate moment, it's uncomfortable.
Right.
And I guess I'm, you know, kind of relating this to what I just said about social media. It looks to me like everyone who's putting up pictures of them as a mom or as a wife is kind of trying to create this portrait, this illusion of hominess and intimacy that they're having with themselves. Sorry, do you want me to go unplug the phone right now?
No, but we'll just roll through it.
All right. Intimacy is that we are these creatures who, like, you know, eat avocado toast and have teepees in our houses and love to cuddle with our friends and our kids and our husbands and wear thick socks, and that's stupid. Right. That's not what intimacy is, and that's not what love is, and that's not what relationships are. But the two have become really intertwined in this strange climate we live in.
Kat Kinsman is the editor-at-large of Tasting Table and the author of High Anxiety. She'll be talking about that book, which deals with anxiety, in an upcoming episode. But for this one, I wanted to include what she said about the intimacy that can sometimes only come from the channels social media provides us.
We live in such an interesting time that you can plug yourself into other people without having to leave your house. And I wonder if that is a good thing or a bad thing. I think about that an awful lot because I do go into phases where it's really hard for me to leave my house because there's, you know, a slight tendency toward agoraphobia with the particular kind of anxiety I have. But I know I can go right on Twitter. I can go right on, you know, any other sort of social media platform or text a friend, and I feel much less alone. I think there's a divide for me because there's social media with people I do know and with people I don't know. I've been lucky enough to have some of the closest people in my life be people who I met through social media. And I think I might be an outlier in this because of what I happen to write about. There's this a potentially intimate connection where strangers come to me in a really vulnerable way. And because there isn't the physical awkwardness of, hey, here, you know, we're trying to know each other awkwardly over coffee. We can go right to the headspace, to that place where we are actually living, where there aren't these layers between. There isn't that vulnerability that comes from that strange social interaction. Somebody will pop right into my Twitter DMs, somebody I don't know, and say, I see you out there, help me. I mean, I think when it comes down to it, all of us just want to be seen. We want somebody to see us. there and acknowledge that they see us. I always joke that my dogs are sort of like that, where they walk over to me and I'll say to them, I see you. They just want to be acknowledged. And I think there's something in us that just wants that. I do go through phases. We're moving into a time when it gets darker out there earlier and it gets cold. And if I could have a tranquilizer dart shot into my neck and not wake up till April, that would be great. 'Cause it's sort of hard for me to leave the house. I think if I didn't have that particular way of connecting with people, it would make me feel incredibly alienated if I was just stabbing out into the dark for somebody to see me. But I think I've made a safe harbor for a lot of people. So I maybe am in a position where people are reaching out to me.
Sidney Engelberg is on the faculty of the Hebrew University and Ono Academic College, both in Jerusalem. He wrote a 3-part series on the loneliness of social media on Psychology Today after a particular photo of him went viral. The photo showed Engelberg holding a student's baby while teaching his class, a simple gesture meant to calm down the fussy child and allow its mother to focus. Apparently, another student snapped the image and posted it to Facebook without Engelberg's knowledge, and soon it went viral. Interview requests came to the professor from around the world.
I suspect that this photo for many people was the equivalent of a Rorschach test. Now, if you're familiar with Rorschach ink block tests, you know that they are these ambiguous shapes that are shown to individuals, and people are asked to say what they see. Mm-hmm. And what happens in a situation where something is ambiguous is that people project onto the ink block all kinds of personal priorities, concerns, ways of thinking. And I think that my photo functioned as a type of Rorschach block, that the people simply projected onto my photo all kinds of things that they're lacking in life and that they're looking for in life. And so I ended up receiving this incredible number, I'm talking about literally thousands, of emails, Facebook friendship requests, messages from all over the place saying how I was an example of humanity, how I was an example of true education, how I was an example of male identification with feminist values. It just went on and on and on. And people projected all of these different things onto the photograph. So that's one way of looking at it, but it doesn't really explain the social media side of it, which is why so many people felt a need to like it, to share it, to pass it on. And as I wrote in those articles or those blogs on Psychology Today, it seemed to me that for many of the people, what they were actually searching for was an opportunity to be part of a human encounter.
In part 1 of the series, you said that the activity on social media ultimately showed a deep underlying sense of loneliness.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you explain what you saw and how it read as such?
Well, look, let me approach the answer from a slightly different direction.
Okay.
And that is, if you take a look at the academic literature in a wide range of different fields, I'm talking about literature and positive psychology on the research on happiness. I'm talking about literature in the field of business administration, looking at management and leadership. I'm talking about research in the field of education. I'm talking about research in the field of human relations management and cognitive psychology. Seemingly very, very diverse fields, but all of them stress certain common findings. And those are, number one, that people are searching for authenticity, that people are searching for engagement, that people can improve their lives through mindfulness. Now, all of those are activities that require, first of all, an enormous amount of self-reflection and self-awareness. And secondly, they require an ability to interact in a meaningful way with others. Now, when all that you're doing is staring at your cell phone and whatever pops up either on your Facebook page or whatever particular platform, Instagram, Pinterest, you are most comfortable with, how on earth do you achieve that level of self-reflection and self-awareness, which is going to ensure that you are authentic in your interactions, that you are able to engage others and to feel engaged, that you are able to practice mindfulness? You just can't do it.
Well, conversely, what are examples of meaningful connection?
Well, I think any number of quite straightforward examples. All you need to do is take a look at the way that a parent looks at their new infant and their new infant looks back at them to see an authentic and meaningful and engaged connection. It's not the same thing as looking at a photo of your infant.
Is there a way to articulate what's involved in that look or that gaze that isn't there on Facebook?
There is a way to do so. It's rather complex though. And the easiest way that I can encapsulate it is to break it down into 3 overlapping areas. One area is the area of emotional intelligence that most people are familiar with, at least in terms of the terminology. And, you know, that involves self-awareness and self-regulation and directed motivation and empathy and components of that nature. The second area is the area of social skills, and social skills involves skills such as the ability to collaborate, the ability to be part of a team, the ability to negotiate, the ability to resolve conflict, the ability to meaningfully communicate with others. So that's a second area overlapping with emotional intelligence. And the third area is the area of cognitive skills. And cognitive skills are our problem-solving skills, our decision-making skills, you know, all of those skills that we use in order to deal with real-life situations. And once again, I can only repeat what I've said previously. You're not going to get emotional intelligence, nor social skills, nor the cognitive skills from simply looking at your social media page, whether it's mobile or on PC.
Right. But I mean, we're still living lives, going to work, interacting with people there, carrying on, you know, quote unquote, real relationships in addition to being connected on social media. So would you say that we're really in a dire situation, or just that things are changing based on the rise of the use of these things?
I don't think anybody has, at this point in time, a well-founded answer to that question, because first of all, we're in a transition phase. We have no idea what the generation who are today 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old and who are totally glued to cell phones, to iPads and so on, how they are going to interact as adults. We only know how current adults interact with one another, and younger adults who are already in a transition phase, but they are not a generation who have known nothing but that kind of interaction. The other thing that is very, very unclear is one of the problems that we know, at least from a statistical point of view, is that there's been an explosion in terms of diagnosed individuals with learning disabilities. It doesn't really matter what the nature of the learning disability is. But, the figures are astonishing. I saw one recent research report that in 2000, approximately, around 4 to 5% of school children were diagnosed as having learning disabilities. In 2014, that it skyrocketed to almost 45%. Now, is this a misleading statistic? Is it simply that we're more aware of the phenomenon, or is something going on? I don't know.
Right.
I don't think anybody at this point knows. But one thing we do know, that one of the great myths of the last few decades is the myth of multitasking. And I don't need to tell you, because I'm sure you've seen it in the popular literature all over the place, that people have been encouraged to develop their ability to multitask. There's been all of this pop psychology written about how women are better at multitasking than men are, etc., etc. This is one of the great myths of the last few decades, because all of the hard research, certainly in cognitive psychology and the neurosciences, show that people are incapable of multitasking. What people are able to do is to shift their attention very, very quickly from one task to another. But invariably what happens is that the quality of their ability to deal with the specific tasks deteriorates because of the shift from one task to another. So that if people focus and concentrate on just one task without interruptions, without disruptions, the quality of the work, the productivity, the effectiveness of what they do is significantly greater than if they're constantly being interrupted, disrupted, and switching from one task to another.
And you would say this is the same thing that's happening with our use of social media in terms of meaningful connection. So we're sitting in front of somebody having a coffee, but we're looking at our phones and shifting attention back and forth.
And so you're switching your attention the whole time. That has to impact on the quality of the interaction between the two of you and the nature of the relationship.
And how does that translate into loneliness?
It's not accidental nor coincidental that probably the best known text in social psychology is Elliot Erickson's text, which was titled The Social Animal. We are biologically social animals. We are built biologically and genetically to be part of social groups. As such, when we are not part of a social group, we inevitably feel a sense of loneliness. It's just built into us. It's part of our psyche. Now, when people are inadvertently, because they're certainly not doing it intentionally, but when they inadvertently create situations where they are not interacting in a really meaningful way with others, and in an authentic way, and in an engaged way, and in a mindful way with others, then that impacts our basic psyche and the fact that we are not allowing ourselves to be the social animals that we are. And the inevitable outcome is loneliness. Increasingly, we see people talking about the need to unplug. And the idea is that because of the pressure and the stress and negative social impact of too much social media, too much technology, too much engagement with things computerized, we need to unplug from time to time in order to recharge our batteries, refresh ourselves, and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a terrific idea, but the fact of the matter is that if we look at Jewish tradition, that's precisely what at least observant Jews have been doing for 2,500 years, which is the Jewish day runs from sunset to sunset. So sunset Friday evening is the onset of the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And if you're an observant Jew, what you do with the onset of the Sabbath is that you switch off all your cell phones, television, no DVDs, nothing. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't enjoy electricity, but what do you do on the Sabbath? You do two things. First of all, it is traditional for all of the family to get together for the Friday evening Sabbath meal. And because there are no distractions, there's no television, there's no radio, there's no cell phones, there's no PCs, there's no iPads, there's no distractions, you interact with each other. And the second thing that you do is that you think. You're not being either entertained or occupied with work or in some way distracted by extraneous things. You have to think. And I believe it was the existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard who said that boredom is the fear of being alone with yourself. And when you think about it, that's a very, very profound statement, because what it really boils down to is that when people say, I'm bored, what they're really saying is, I don't have the resources, the personal resources and the psychic resources to fill in my time meaningfully. I need something external to fill in that void which exists within myself. And I think there's a huge amount of truth to that.
Right.
So if boredom is the fear of being with yourself, then the opposite is true as well. Where you really are able to reflect and to just think about what's significant in your life, what's meaningful in your life, what your priorities are, what your value system is, and so on, then you're not bored because you're reflecting.
What's the solution? How do we overcome loneliness and create meaningful connections? You've said the Jews do it through having that day off, so to speak. What are other ways that we can do this?
I think there are a number of ways. The fact that there's been an explosion of articles on mindfulness is a reflection of exactly this, because all of the material on mindfulness stresses the need to detach from what you typically do and to engage in things that you wouldn't typically do. So for too many people, mindfulness is equated with meditation. But meditation is only one means of achieving mindfulness. You can achieve mindfulness in other ways as well. Just, for example, by consciously paying attention to the experience that you're going through in the moment, that's being mindful. Now, I'm sure you've observed in the same way as I have, people going to all kinds of events and experiencing all kinds of experiences, but they're so caught up with taking selfies or reporting where they are to friends or posting it on Facebook or whatever, they aren't really paying attention to the experience itself.
Right. There's the joke, it didn't happen if we didn't tweet it, or...
Exactly. But, the opposite is true, that if you're so busy tweeting it, you're not really experiencing what is happening. So there are many, many ways to achieve these meaningful connections, but they all require a degree of self-awareness, self-reflection, self-regulation.
How do you achieve this?
When the selfie becomes an end in itself, or the tweet becomes an end in itself, then there's no possibility of having something really meaningful. I mean, take a tweet which we haven't really spoken about, 126 characters. How deep and meaningful a conversation can you have with 126 characters? You can't. You can't. So I'm not in any way arguing that you can't have very meaningful, even inspirational material on social media. You can, but only when that material has a narrative quality to it. That is to say, it tells a complete and full story that people can identify with, that people can even be inspired by. Let's not confuse that with the actual platform itself. The platform is just a means. Most of the comments, I would say somewhere in the region of 95%, are simply comments like, "You're a great man," "Fantastic," "Continue being an example to the world." I mean, they're not profound comments at all, which is a reflection, once again, of exactly what we've been discussing.
Right.
People are trying to reach out, but they don't really know how to do that in a very effective way. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is another reflection of loneliness.
Only in her freshman year at Brown, Anna Caltabiano has done a lot of thinking on this topic, both for the Huffington Post and in 2 novels.
It was, in a huge way, it was about loneliness. And it was about loneliness that I think we all feel to some extent. But I wanted to explore that feeling in a world where you had to choose whether to feel everything, including that nasty sense of loneliness, including that frustration you feel of why do I feel this way, should be happy, and feel everything, including that, including the good, or feel nothing at all.
As you put it, you posed the question, quote, "If you could choose a world without loneliness, without shame, grief, misery, or feeling of any kind, would you, if it also meant that you lost the simple pleasure of a picnic on a sunny day or the joy of falling in love?"
That was really my way of exploring things on the page as I was living through that difficult time between middle school and high school. I saw that around me, I saw that in myself to some extent, and I knew that we were all dealing with it. But there wasn't much online that I could find. It was a lot of facts and statistics. I wanted to find a way that I could explore it through fiction.
Tell me about that time, or how do you think, now that you have a little perspective on it, loneliness was something you were feeling so acutely, and how did you see it around you? Was it in kind of everybody around you, or your peer group specifically?
I think it wasn't everyone around me, and I think it still isn't everyone around me. It's the idea that now in the 21st century we have social media, we have all these ways to connect to people, half a world away. So therefore, we should be happy. We should be fulfilling that human need to connect. But I think social media, in some ways, it's a bit dangerous that it provides this illusion of being connected. And when we have this illusion of being connected, we no longer seek it out.
Yeah, well, expand
we feel
on
like
that.
we've satisfied that.
Yeah, I mean, the article that you wrote in the Huffington Post, it's called Loneliness in the Age of Social Networking. And you talk about just that. Social media can satisfy some aspects of our human need to connect, but not all of it. In your experience, can you explain what it does and doesn't do for us?
In my experience, I look at it in kind of two camps. One, social media, you can either use it as a substitute for direct face-to-face communication, or you can also use it as a supplement for direct face-to-face human communication, and it's how you use it. I look at it as kind of being lonely in this age of social media. It's kind of like being lonely in a crowd. That you have all these people around you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can connect to each and every one of them. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to mask the fact that you feel lonely when you look online and you see that you have 500 Facebook friends and you think that, okay, have that need satisfied. And then you might feel frustrated because you still feel lonely and you think, what's wrong with me? And that can kind of lead down a different trail, but it's so easy to hide the fact even from yourself. And I look at this and I think, I wonder if people had this same sort of as social media good as the social media bad when telephones were at first introduced. Of course, I wasn't even around when cell phones started first being a thing, but I wonder if people wondered if phones would replace human contact, like they're wondering now with social media. Do you feel you call your daughter or your friend instead of meeting them face to face?
Right.
Or on the other hand, do you find that having a phone only increases the opportunities you have to talk to them?
Another example of this kind of thing is in that Huffington Post article on loneliness. You open with a scene in which you and a friend who lives out of the country are spending a Friday night watching a movie together. It's through screen sharing, though, so you weren't together in person. You were spending time together. I mean, would you say this is an example of a way in which this is new technology? It's not social media per se, but is this an example of a way in which those new technologies can satisfy our need for connection, or that it's kind of a poor try?
I think it can definitely help satisfy our need for connection if we use it as a supplement. I think definitely if all I did was screen share and chat away in my small room with no outside face-to-face communication, I think that would drive me a bit insane.
Right.
And I definitely don't think that's healthy, but a nice balance. And it's hard to know where the balance lies, and I think that's also very different for each person.
Right. Your writing does focus on the loneliness side of this, so I wonder if you're seeing that a lot in your peers. On your Facebook page's bio, you classify your writing as focusing on an adolescent generation consumed by social apathy and self-loathing, and that can only find solace through these electronic connections. Why is that such an important issue to you to explore?
I think it all comes down with my idea of I really do think that everyone has that certain amount of loneliness in them, for good or for bad. And when you throw social media into the mix, when you see on Facebook that there's this girl who looks absolutely perfect to you, that she's beautiful and she has all these pictures to prove it, she has thousands of friends, and you have the numbers there in front of you to prove that, and she's living a wonderful life because you see all the pictures of the events she goes to, it makes you feel a little more lonelier. And you can beat yourself up about that and say, why am I not like her? What's wrong with me? Everyone else is also like this. What's wrong with me? Because I don't feel that way, and everyone else looks happy. And I think social media is this way where all of a sudden you get to really see that it's put in front of your face. And once you multiply that by all the other social media platforms and all the millions of people who look happy it can seem daunting, it can seem isolating. But when you examine that, it's interesting because everyone's trying to put their best foot forward. They're photoshopping a little bit sometimes. They're choosing which photos to put online. They're trying to take photos at events to show that they were there, because now it seems like if you don't take a photo, you weren't really there. You know, and you're geotagging like crazy and using hashtags and all to feel a part of something. And everyone is doing this. It's definitely a balance. I used to not have a Facebook for the longest time, and I would miss out on all these events. Or it would just be that much harder for me because I'd have to ask someone, oh, can you email that to me? I didn't see that it was there. And they go, oh, sure, but it's always that extra few minutes of sending that over, or people talking about something and me having to ask for a little more background because I didn't see it on Twitter. It's a bit difficult when you're a teenager and everyone else's vocabularies are built upon social media. It's definitely like a common language. And when you're missing a part of that, you feel like you're a bit left out. But I think social media can also be really used to start these meaningful communications. Mm-hmm. You can have a really shy boy who doesn't feel comfortable reaching out, and all of a sudden, if he has the internet and he has another opportunity to reach out to people, and he starts building up friends from other countries who might share similar views, also be shy, also be a little hesitant to reach out to the people around them face to face, he might find some confidence, and that might be a bit of a building block to talk to people face to face around him.
For more, head to thelonelyhour.com. This is The Lonely Hour, produced by Pale Groove. I'm your host, Julia Bainbridge. I'm an editor and a writer, mainly about food, but I also have a lot of feelings, loneliness being one of them. I want to explore that feeling because it's pervasive, but the literature on it is not. Each episode of The Lonely Hour is going to focus on a particular topic, whether it's a community or a profession, an age group, or an activity that seems to arouse feelings of loneliness or aloneness. That could be mental illness, for example, or it could be social media's effect on us. It could even be motherhood. The idea is to catalog tidbits on this very human feeling. Because we all feel lonely sometimes, I want to explore how we feel it. Motherhood is, quote, the state or experience of having and raising a child, end quote. Its very definition implies accompaniment. But motherhood can be a lonely-making experience, whether it's because of postpartum depression, the pressures of guarding a human life, or the quest to get pregnant in the first place. Kate Rope works for Selene Institute, and she's going to talk about that. In fact, she'll talk about it a lot, and I promise it's not an ad for Selene, but hearing the range of services the organization offers to families is a lesson in the kinds of difficulties that can come with motherhood. Kate has also written about the loneliness of motherhood from her own personal experience.
It's one of maybe the greatest identity shift and lifestyle change you're going to go through in your life. And so the expectation that would happen easily and be this blissful event, this Hollywood image we have of it, is just preposterous once you've been through it. But until you've been through it, that's what you think it is, because that's what the stories we see, and that's the cards, and this your beautiful blessing and your bundle of joy, and Nobody says the bundle of joy may drive you crazy for 3 months because it doesn't sleep and it screams all the time, and that may be really hard to hear, and you may not feel like it's a bundle of joy. You may feel like it's a bundle of burden,
Right.
So I think a lot of this, and I know this from talking with the clinicians where I work, that one of the most difficult things is the difference between your expectations and reality. So you have this expectation that motherhood is going to be this beautiful thing and that you're going to do well at it. And then you find out that it's a really difficult thing that you have to learn to be good at. And then that clash is where a lot of women can kind of fall down and,
Right.
and struggle. And then when you add that the hormones are on top of this, sort of like puppeteers behind the scene with your moods, it's a perfect storm.
Right. This gets into my next question, and to name the organization you work for, it's Selene Institute, and it's a nonprofit that provides clinical care for mothers as well as funding for women's reproductive and maternal mental health research. So you talked about it a little just now, but perhaps a mix of your own experience and then what the Selene Institute is discovering are the major mental health issues for mothers today.
So at Selene, we focus in 5 major categories, and they're all related to trying to be and being a mother and a parent and a family. So we work with women who are struggling with infertility, and that brings a lot of mental health issues, and those women often feel very isolated, and really having a place that can support them and that knows what that experience is like is really important. And then miscarriage, which is extremely common but very rarely talked about and is a loss that involves real grief, but often isn't treated as such and isn't talked about. And then child loss, mostly related to stillbirth, which, though not as common as miscarriage, thankfully, is again a loss that that our society doesn't really understand or know how to handle. And so we provide support for women who go through miscarriage and child loss. They have something that's called disenfranchised grief, which means it's not a recognized grief. So there's not the typical societal supports in place to help you go through it like there would be when a parent dies and you have, funerals and wakes and memorial services, and people sort of have rituals and they know how to talk about it. People don't know how to talk about it when it's a loss during pregnancy or right after birth. So those women often feel very isolated and alone, and we have experts who can help them feel supported and recognize that what they're going through is normal and sort of help them, come into a new normal. And then there's perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and that can be during pregnancy as well. That's another thing that's now being recognized, is that a lot of what ends up being postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety is actually developing maybe about 50% of it during pregnancy. So that's another time that women can seek treatment and begin to address it, and then that will often mitigate the effects of it after giving birth. And then we do parenting support for parents of children with special needs, or if your kid's in the NICU, or you're just struggling with getting your child to sleep. So Selene has a sleep consultant and a breastfeeding consultant, and we have workshops. So you can come to Selene for individual therapy. You can come for support groups related to different topics like infertility or miscarriage or being a new mom. And then there's also workshops on helping get your kid to sleep, because sleep is extremely important when it comes to mental health. And that's actually something I didn't mention, talking about sort of why does this happen in the first year after a baby's born. Well, that's probably the worst year of sleep you're ever going to have.
Right.
And sleep is just incredibly tied to mental well-being. So a sleep consultant, and then a breastfeeding a lactation consultant who can help women with breastfeeding issues, because having difficulty with breastfeeding, which is common, is also a big trigger for postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. So, and there's a lot of pressure to breastfeed, and so when women struggle at it, there's a lot of, they tend to beat themselves up or feel like they've failed in some way at one of the first tests of motherhood, when in fact, it used to be that everyone was breastfeeding around you and you learned how to breastfeed, and now we're sort of, this is, talking about loneliness and motherhood, we're on our own to learn these things, yet we expect them to come naturally, and when they don't, it's a big shock, and it's, again, that mix of expectation and reality. And so being able to help women work through breastfeeding difficulties is really important to their well-being, and also if they're having difficulty to the extent that they need to switch to formula feeding, helping them make that transition without feeling bad about it and bad about themselves.
You talk about we're now on our own as opposed to some time before now. Can you expand on that a little bit? What are the differences?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the biggest shifts in motherhood that we don't acknowledge explicitly, but with extended families no longer living in the same place, with families being smaller than they used to be, we don't have the village. We're not seeing our aunts raising kids next to us. We're not, raising our cousins. So we don't have this support in place, and yet we haven't acknowledged that it doesn't exist. So one of the things Selene tries to do is recreate the village. We have baby bouncers in your therapy room, so you can bring your baby, so that you can make it be a more sort of organic flow of getting support with your child, and not operating as an infant and a mother just off on their own in a home. But that's the reality, is that one, we societally, just culturally, we've lost those big families being in the same place, and then our structural, we haven't replaced them with good government structure for childcare and things like that would enable motherhood to be an easier task. And so we are trying to do everything. If you're working, you're trying to work, and you're trying to make a nutritious lunch to get your kid to daycare, and attend the PTA meeting. And sometimes you're falling down at doing that, and you see that as a personal failure. But it's not. It's a structural failure. We haven't replaced the village with a good structure that gives women the support that they need, that is, part and parcel of family and of raising people. So I think that, Selene tries to create that in the physical space and does a beautiful job. And then I think with my writing and what I'm doing, I'm trying to create that virtually. I'm trying to say, motherhood is difficult. It's okay to struggle. And when you do, let's create this network that you have, that you can call on, that you can draw on to get the support you need to move through that struggle to the next one.
Right. Yeah, so speaking of your writing, you wrote in the Huffington Post last year an article called The Bittersweet Loneliness of Motherhood. And so I wonder, can you describe the feeling of isolation you felt or perhaps still feel as a mother, even when, as you put it, you're surrounded by people who love me all the time?
Yeah, it's ironic. So there's a couple of things that come into that for me. I mean, and some of this has changed since I wrote that piece, but some of it is the same. I think that motherhood is by nature a solitary thing, and that might seem weird to say because you've brought another person into the world, but that person relates to you in a different way than you relate to them. So it's not an even give and take. And I remember when my daughter was born and I was in the hospital and my mom was there, I said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all the things I said to you and for how poorly I treated you when I was a teenager, because holding this little breathing being right now, I know she is never going to love me as much as I love her. I can just tell, Mm-hmm. And that is true, that there is this, there is an imbalance there, and it's meant to be there. But you have this incredibly intimate relationship with somebody, and yet you bear a responsibility in the relationship that they don't. And so that just changes it a little bit, and that is a little bit lonely and isolating. It's a privilege. It's this, I mean, it's sort of it's almost like a power trip at times. I can kind of understand how someone would, want to take over the world or something because they have power. You feel like, wow, I am responsible for this being. And sometimes that's incredibly, you feel like it's a privilege, and sometimes it's an incredible burden. So that was what I was talking about in the piece. And I think that that's just sort of there. And then there's kind of like this feeling that a lot of moms have, and I'm not saying all moms have this, and I'm not saying dads don't have this, but I have this, and I've talked to a lot of moms who have this, and I got a lot of responses to that piece from women who said they related to it, which is sort of the idea that a feeling of like the buck stops with me. And it's lonely at the top, right? So if you're ultimately in charge, it's lonely there because no one's above you to bounce things off of. So I think that has changed as my children have grown older, and maybe I'm not breastfeeding, or I'm not sort of doing these parenting tasks that were exclusive to me that my husband didn't share. Now I feel like our parenting is growing, and it's egalitarianism, but I still sort of feel this ultimate responsibility, and and that might be a personality thing. I mean, I do think a lot of women share that, but there is something about that at times, in moments of crisis, in moments of, or making the right decision about a school, or about talking about a difficult topic, or wherever, I sort of feel like I got to get this right. And there's a part of it I just don't want to give up. There's it feels really special. It feels really special that that I got to bring this person into the world, that I got to feed them with my body, which luckily for me was not a difficult thing. There were many other difficult things. That wasn't one of them. And that we get to, just like cuddle in bed and tell each other how much we love each other. I mean, it's this fantastic intimacy that's, as good as falling in love with the person you spend your life with. I mean, I guess it is falling in love with another person you're going to spend your life with. So there's a part of it I wouldn't give up, this sort of just special secret bond I feel I have with my daughters that is solitary, but not in a bad way.
Were other friends of yours having children as well?
Yeah, I was sort of a little bit late to the game. Most of my friends had already popped one out by the time I started.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the kind of isolation that might come from that, whether you're late to the game and you feel kind of, lonely because you aren't reproducing, or if you are one of the first to have kids, and there is so much that comes with that your whole life, the whole way you're living your days becomes different. And one of my friends who had children early, I think that she would feel lonely sometimes even when around us, because she was recognizing how different her day-to-day was from ours, and there was now a gap between us,
Yeah, I definitely I've talked with friends who were on the early side of their cohort, and they definitely felt that way. I don't think I was so much on the late side that I felt that way. I was the only one to have an anxiety disorder afterwards, and that was extremely isolating because I felt like no one could relate to it, not even my husband, and he really tried, and he just couldn't get it. He'd say, these things you're saying don't make sense, and I was like, but they do to me, and there was a point at which I realized he couldn't help me either. Which was the first time in our relationship that had happened. So that was incredibly isolating. But getting back to talking about sort of mental health issues, lack of social support is a major risk factor for perinatal depression and anxiety. So when women are becoming mothers in kind of a void of support, that puts them at risk, and it makes sense. But that's something that is another reason that at Selene they're trying to build a village, and I'm trying to build a village in my writing, because the more support you have, the better your chances of not experiencing it or recovering from it more rapidly.
Molly Guy, owner of bridal showroom Stone Fox Bride, was part of last week's episode on social media, but I initially reached out to her to talk about giving birth and about mothering.
I think a couple intimate experiences for me have been childbirth. I've had 2 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about the person that I was pretending to be or that I wanted to be when I first started dating my husband and the person I was when I was giving birth, they're 2 totally different people. And, the courtship process, I think for a lot of women is about, shiny teeth and bikini waxes and giggles and little stories and light meals and brisk walks and hand in hand and all that stuff. And that's really great. That's kind of a drug that can be its own drug. But the end game to all of that stuff is about real connection. And I think the couple times when my husband and I were most connected, whether or not we wanted to be, was when I was giving birth to our kids. And it was totally bloody and awful and painful and beautiful and scary and primal. And I'm still amazed that I've gone through that experience with him. I was anticipating a postpartum depression, and I, in fact, had the opposite. I actually haven't found motherhood alienating, but I also work full time, and I have a lot of friends, and I'm not living in the middle of nowhere. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think I'm really lucky in that regard. It's brought me closer to the women I know and to women I want to know, and but I'm not with my kids very often. I'm at work.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm with them, I try to be present with them. But, I think about my grandmother and my grandmother's generation, or my mom and my mom's generation. They couldn't just hop onto a blog and Google, effects of maternal suicide on children, or they couldn't, log into some chat room and find a community of women who are also having a hard time, or there weren't the kind of antidepressants and the medicines and the research weren't available for them back then. My heart actually really aches for my grandmother's generation and my mom's generation. I'm amazed. I mean, I know that people were popping a lot of pills in the 50s especially. There was a lot of Valium just to get through the day. I don't know how they did it. I mean, being with your children all the time is hard. And especially if you don't have a place to vent or a place to go.
Yeah, because it's on top of being with your children, the expectation to be in a constant state of, bliss and fulfillment with this new role of motherhood.
Right. It's the opposite of that.
Right.
There's that Jennifer Senior book, All Joy and No Fun, that's, I think, sort of sums up motherhood perfectly. It's not fun, but there is sort of this beautiful baseline of joy that comes with the fact that it's not fun.
Right.
I mean, I find a lot of esteem in just being able to care for my kids when, it wasn't that long ago I couldn't even care for myself. When my kids were born, especially when my daughter came, I experienced this massive well of fear and compassion for every living being on the planet that I had never had before. And she was born in the spring, and the Sandy Hook shootings were 6 months later, and I felt and I feel that on a cellular level in a way that I never would have before. And I think that is lonely. And even today, I told my daughter was up last night with a fever, and her neck was hurting. So, of course, I was on the phone with the doctor in the middle of the night asking if she had meningitis. And I told my husband that today, and he was laughing, why would she have meningitis? And I think she has meningitis because I'm her mom. and because I feel her in a different way than he ever would.
Right.
And that's scary, and that's lonely, and that's scary as shit. This is conjecture based on what I've talked about with friends. I think fathers are more anxious in that like hovering caveman kind of way, that something's going to go wrong and they're not going to be able to protect their child. But I think and they fear it as a caretaker and as a provider. But I think as mothers, we fear it in a different, from a heart place. Like, I swear, this is so annoying to say, but like I was looking at, I was in the zoo after I gave birth to my first daughter, and I was looking at just these like little monkeys and just bawling. Like, I couldn't believe that everyone in this world had once been a baby, and that so many babies in the world aren't properly cared for. My uncle wrote a book about three Holocaust survivors, and there's some throwaway line in the book about this baby that was thrown from a train going to Auschwitz and discovered in a field at 9 days old. And I often think about babies who aren't properly cared for and who aren't tended to, or the kids in Syria right now or other refugee places, where raising a child takes so much. My kids need so much love and so much comfort and so much care, and so much. And I think that kind of basic care really informs the way we are later in life. I think that informs our intimacy, it informs our sex lives, it informs our relationships, it informs our work, the kind of love that we crave and that we need.
Right.
And if you're not given that as a kid, I don't, I don't know.
There are a lot of walking wounded,
Yes.
walking around.
And I didn't realize that until I became a mom. Like, I suddenly looked back at every guy I ever dated and was like, oh my God, maybe that's why, maybe that's why he never called me back after the 5th date. I mean, it had never honestly occurred to me that we were all parented in these different ways that could inform how we love one another and how we need to connect to one another until I had kids. Until I had children, I was very casual with my life. I don't think I've ever said that out loud. I was very casual. I partied very hard. I did not use protection when I had casual sex. I didn't wear a seatbelt, and I really didn't care what happened. And it was sort of part of that. I thought it was romantic and cool and tragic and interesting. And there is nothing to me that's romantic or cool or tragic or interesting about the idea of my 2 daughters growing up without a mother. And it is I will be goddamned if anyone else raises my kids. And I feel that on such a deep place that I take such precautions with my life now in a way that I never would. I get every mole checked out. I wear my seatbelt. I don't cross in the middle of the street. I value my time here because I have to be of service to these little beings. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does.
But that's the shit. I remember putting my seatbelt on after I had my daughter and thinking, like, I can't die in a car crash. Who's going to take care of her? My husband's going to remarry some 27-year-old hipster. No. Like, this is my primary purpose for today. And there's something really scary about that. And it's profound and terrifying at the same time.
Alyssa Shalasky is a food and travel writer who sold 2 TV pitches this pilot season. The first is about dating, and the second one is a half-hour comedy about a woman who decides to have a baby on her own through a sperm donor. In this case, art imitates life, because that's exactly what Alyssa herself did.
I can tell they're they say I don't have a wedding ring on, and they hear me say like, well, I did it. It's always like or I never refer to like some baby daddy. I can tell that they're wondering what the deal is, and I just always say like, oh, I had her on my own. And I this isn't some kind of strategy, but I say it with like such like triumph in my voice, and like such like, I'm so much luckier than everybody else. I had her on my own, like, instead of like, oh, it didn't really work out the way I planned, and like I ended up having to have a baby on my own. Because I don't feel like I feel truly like I am so psyched by my decision, and it was so the right decision. And I think that just comes out in the way I explain our situation to people, and people sort of just like, it's contagious. Like when you think that what you did was 100% right and like super fucking cool, like whoever you're talking to is going to see it that way. Not that it necessarily matters how people see me, but the truth is like, I'm human, and I was a little bit insecure about that. Like, what would people think, that I was a freak? Would people think my daughter was some result of a science experiment, like kind of like a weird science experiment? Would guys think that I wasn't hot enough to get a real man to impregnate me, that I had to resort to like, these were like very sort of personal fears I had, but that, I was a little bit nervous. So now I'm so happy that like none of that shit mattered, by the way. Like, not like, guys think it's sexy as hell. Other wives think, like, oh, you're so lucky you don't have like, I wish I had done it that way. Not all, but I get that. And other people who judge, by the way, I really could give a shit.
What did those mothers who are kind of jealous of your having had a child on your own, what's the reason for that?
I mean, I get it a lot, and I think it's many times because women are just being, they're being sweet, and like they sort of mean it, but they don't really mean it. But they're sort of trying to relate and like take any sort of like friction out of the conversation. But the ones who really mean it do say, like, in the early years, especially, their husbands didn't help that much, and like there was a lot of resentment, and managing a marriage on top of managing a newborn is like a lot of stress, man. Like, it's a lot. With Hazel, I just have to take care of me and take care of her, and we're sort of like the same. When they're this young, you're sort of the same person anyway. So I don't have any of that. It's still like a very luxurious lifestyle for me in that respect.
Are you concerned about, as time goes on, if it'll be too much?
Get harder? I don't think it will. I honestly, life without a child was so much harder and more painful for me than any kind of struggle I think that we'll face together. I was becoming like this sad and sort of bitter person as I turned, I've always wanted a kid, but as I turned 35, then 36, and 37, I was becoming, I was becoming a little bit depressed about it, and that's not my nature, and I have no interest in living a sad life. I didn't want that for myself, and so that's what really got me thinking about just like, let's just do it. Like, what the fuck am I waiting for? Like, a guy? Like, that's ridiculous. I'm successful. I have tons of friends who are like extremely involved and loving, and I'm really lucky that I have this great family, and we all live under the same roof. I mean, that's kind of what makes it a no-brainer. So I had all those things going for me, and I like myself. Like, I like the adult Alyssa that I've become. I became kind of exactly the woman I dreamed that I would be one day. And so, like, why was I crying myself to sleep at night? Like that. I didn't deserve those feelings. So I was just like, I'm done. Like, I'm done feeling sorry for myself. Like, I'm gonna fix this. It's totally fixable. This is 2015 at the time. This is like the new world. Like, I'm gonna have a baby. Like, this. What am I waiting for?
How did you get yourself out of those depressing thoughts before you decided to have a child?
On smaller scales, like, we all we call it in my family like the yuckies. Like you just have it, like you're having the yuckies, like everything sucks, you hate everyone, nothing's going your way. I have a good relationship with myself where I know what to do to feel better. Like I know that I like maybe need to book a trip so I have something to look forward to. I know like the one coffee shop where like that latte is like the best thing that's ever happened to my life, and I just like savor every second. I know like the great consignment shop where I always find one thing that I love, and those little excursions or mental excursion, physical, whatever it is, like they get me out of the bad place. I feel better, and you know, I usually bounce back pretty quickly.
Okay, so how exactly did you come to the decision, both to have a child and ultimately to have one by yourself?
I always wanted to be a writer, and I always wanted to be a mother. I don't know when I had those epiphanies, but I'm lucky that I've always known those two things, because it's sort of prevented me from ever feeling too lost, because those were always like my guiding lights or whatever. The writing thing happened pretty not easily. I've worked my ass off throughout the years, but you know, I went to college in New York, I interned at MTV, I got all the right jobs, I worked for all the right editors, I worked my ass off, I loved every second of it, and one day I had a book, I don't know how that happened, and then I suddenly like sort of became this like wannabe TV writer, I don't know how that happened, but like that was all working out for me, which is like, I don't take that for granted, because a lot of my friends are still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, and I think that's kind of a fun, creative way to live your life too. But professionally, I've always been like, I'm good. But as deeply as I knew I wanted to be a writer, I a million times more even knew I wanted to be a mother. But the problem is, I've never been interested in like, I don't want to say nice guys, but like traditional guys who like want to settle down and get married. I was engaged when I was 25 to that type of man who was a mensch and lovely and handsome and Jewish and all those things, and I don't know what he's doing with his life now, but I wish only good things for him. But I was very uncomfortable in that role, and I sort of extracted myself from it before things got too far. And since then, I think I've just been like so afraid to be bored in a relationship or be too normal in I don't know. I actually really do need some therapy on this front, because I haven't really reflected yet on why since ending that engagement to the nice men who would have married me and given me a lot of babies, why I haven't been able to return to that type of man ever again. I mean, it's been almost 15 years. So since then, I've had a lot of great love and a lot of great romance, none of which I regret, but they were all pretty tumultuous relationships, or they just like the writing was sort of on the wall from the beginning, or they either like lived in another country, or, you know, I wrote a book about a 3-year relationship with a chef who was a delicious human being and sexy and fun, but a chef, and a chef living in another city. And
what does that mean, but a chef?
I mean, we shouldn't stereotype, right?
You said it.
First of all, like real chefs, like good chefs, I have tons of respect for, and I truly believe they're artists. Like they're like sick geniuses, and like they can get away with anything as far as I'm concerned, because they're like operating on another speed altogether. But it's a hard lifestyle. You know, they're never home. Like everyone was like, I was so skinny I've never been skinnier than the years I was dating a chef, because like no one's home. Like you're always alone. I was thinking about this in coming to visit you today, and the loneliest I've ever been in my life was when I was with my chef boyfriend. And it just got me thinking, like, it's so much harder and lonelier and sadder to be in a relationship that you're uncomfortable in than being in no relationship at all. We're at the age where a lot of my friends who sort of had these debatable boyfriends of like 5, 6, 7 years ago, some girls sort of like stuck it out with these guys and just like endured all the shit and the struggle and the heartbreak, and now these guys are like, they're getting married and like the guys now want babies and whatever. And then I bounced, and I sort of do wonder if I put in more time and I was a little less anxious about the whole situation, where we would have been today. But
with him, not with the first guy you were engaged to.
Oh yeah, you know what, Jewel? Like I don't believe in regret, and I never have looked back on my decisions. But as soon as I had my daughter Hazel, something was triggered inside me, and it's like I'm ready, I think, to reflect on and like examine a little more closely my past relationships, because I've always been like an onward and upward person, and like, ooh, I wonder who's around the corner, and this, like, I've tried to, as much as like my heart hurt in a lot of those breakups, I've tried to reframe it like something better is coming, and like it was wrong, and like you're about to find something right, and that helped me. Like, I'm glad that that's my coping mechanism. But now that I think a lot about like the things I want to teach her about life, and the mistakes that I want to help her try not to make, and things like that. And I think until I can do that, I have to really stare my former relationships like in the face, and even if it means, some tears or some regret.
So you had these relationships, and you had some great relationships, but they weren't correct. And you got out of them, and time wore on, and you found yourself, in what headspace, like, what pushed you over the edge into saying, I'm going to do this. So you've talked about it a little bit so far. But.
Yeah. A few things. One, my sister had a baby who I fell madly in love with. She's my younger sister. And I had only, like, love for this child, and only, like, happiness and joy for my sister. But I did find myself a few times walking away from visits with him kind of wanting to cry. And because it wasn't not having anything to do with my sister or the baby, but because it wasn't happening. It was just, like, so palpable. Like, my childlessness was so palpable. And
so that was that a lonely feeling?
Yes. Yeah, it was. Especially because I'm very much like a never let him see you sweat person. Like, positivity is my thing. And I don't think I ever talked to anybody about it. Maybe my mother, but it was extra hard talking about it with my mother and my sister, because they wanted it for me as badly as I wanted it for me. So it was just like heavy. We didn't want to go there all the time. So I was sort of burdened by, my bitterness was growing in a very alone way. And the same thing with like Facebook. It was like anybody who, whether you want a husband so badly you don't have one, you want a baby so badly you don't have one, like, Facebook's rough.
Yeah.
It's rough. And then
you see all these examples in front of you of people who have that, and
it's like, why not me?
Yeah.
Like, I would walk down the streets around this time, and I was 37. It was about a year and a half ago. I would walk down the streets of like Dumbo, where I live, in Brooklyn Heights, and everybody has a baby stroller, carrying a toddler or whatever. And I would just say, like, why not me? Like, what did I do wrong that, like, God is punishing me? Like, how did I fuck up my life so bad that every other woman can find a way to have a child and I can't?
But you did.
But I did. See, and I hated those thoughts. I'm glad I had them, because they were like the catalyst for something great. But it was that big, like, what's wrong with me?
So then you decided.
I was much more, as far as like having a baby unconventionally, I really thought that I would be the type to sort of just like get knocked up and have a baby on my own that way, or co-parent.
Why?
Because like by my 30s, I'm sort of over, like, I kind of have no interest in getting married. Like, even if I met the love of my life outside this door in Red Hook, and maybe I will, I don't want to marry him. Like, I'm just not into it. So like, when you rule out marriage, you're sort of left grouped into this like other set of arrangements, which is like co-parenting or like a long distance like these sort of like alternative relationships, which I'm into big time, but they're not necessarily conducive to having a child. So within that type of relationship, it would either mean getting pregnant by someone, whoever, which I'm so glad I didn't do, or having some kind of co-parenting situation, which I'm also so glad I didn't do, because I can see that getting very messy. And then I had heard a friend of mine, her sister was using a sperm donor, was getting pregnant through artificial insemination, which is the worst term in the world. Like we need to rebrand this. But she was doing insemination, and the sister, I hadn't met her, but I knew she was like very cool and stylish and like fun and always had boyfriends. And again, that goes back to my own insecurity. Like my ego needed to know that cool women did this. And I don't mean like popular or like just like a woman that I think is cool was doing this. And so I invited her on a friend date. We went to City Bakery and we shared pretzel croissants and hot chocolate. And she was cool. I mean, she brushed into that cafe with like the right hat on and like the bag and like great posture and big like glowy skin. And she was just like, here's the deal, like fucking do it. Like this is the sperm bank you use. This is the doctor you go to. This is approximately what it's going to cost. And like, hopefully you're fertile and go for it. And I was just like, cool. All right. Yeah. And I went home that day and I like went to the right sperm bank and booked an appointment at the right doctor. I followed all of her instructions. And before I knew it, I was pregnant. What a relief, because I'd been suffering for so many years from this childlessness and feeling so powerless over my situation. And, it's like I took control and like I was making it happen. Like in the click of a keyboard, I was like making it happen. Like I was on my way to getting pregnant, hopefully. So since that coffee and pretzel croissant with my friend and this moment, I've never had a second of doubt or nervousness. I've just been incredibly at peace and relieved and like thrilled and excited that then it was like that I got pregnant, and now it's that I'm a mom. I feel very much like, there's like that movement, like single mothers by choice. And I haven't really been active. Like I don't really identify with that group for some reason. I'm so happy it exists for other women, but because I just feel I'm not like a single, like that's not my identity, like single mom. Like I'm just a woman. I still, like I'm a woman who, and I guess soon I'll just identify as like a mother, but I'm just a woman like you, like the ladies on the bus and the women at the Soho House. I mean, like at the end of the day, we're all going through the same shit, I think, and we're all a little bit scared, and we all, feel fragile, and we all feel empowered. And I don't know, I don't feel like my situation made me any more, like, I don't know the word, like fractured or, vulnerable than anybody else.
So now your daughter is here. It's been 4 months. Do you find that the pressure of caring for her can be lonely making at all?
What I get during that sort of very private, very quiet time of the day, it's almost like a spirituality. It's almost like what I think people who really believe in God feel like they're never alone because they have God, and like everything's going to be okay because they have God or whatever. I can, in that very quiet moment, I can sort of look at my daughter and feel and like know that like life is good and everything will work out and I'm protected. So that's my quiet. Honestly, it's powerful, those quiet moments, but for me it's not focused on loneliness at all, because I have her. Like I have her forever. No one's going to take her away from me. No one's going to, tear us apart. Is that should we break into song? But so it's just, I don't know, it's really powerful in that sense that like we're gonna be okay. Like, and for a while I wasn't sure I was gonna be okay, and now I can look at her and just like everything, all the shit that happened with work or the TV deals or agents, whatever, I can look at her and like everything is reset. I get it. I get all of that. And I don't know if my journey towards motherhood is part of the reason why I have never thought about it in anything less than like a joyous, thank you, God kind of way. You know, like I moved mountains to get pregnant. I spent a lot of money to get pregnant. I went up against some friends and family members who didn't get it to get pregnant. And so now that I had a healthy pregnancy, that it worked, that I was fertile, that I had the baby, and that she's healthy and beautiful, I can only like, I focus on all of that. Mm-hmm. I don't really, so I don't know, maybe that's part of it. Like, yeah. I don't want to take any of it for granted.
And also it's so fresh.
It's so fresh, and I can remember so easily what it felt like to not have her and how sad I was to be childless. So
when you say going up against some friends and family members, what
for the
there?
Most part, everybody in my life, from like, my best friends to like the lady at the dry cleaners, was like so supportive, like over the top supportive, loving, generous. I had one or two friends that said things like, I'm concerned, like this, have you thought this through? And like, you don't make that much money and da-da-da. And I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear it. And my philosophy was, if you're not going to 100% support me and my pregnancy, then you can't be in my life. You just can't. And I was pretty fucking harsh about it. It ended up in a catastrophic fight with one of my best friends. And she was just trying to be helpful, and it was coming from her heart. And I just fucking like voted her off the island like so quickly, and thank God we've made up. But yeah, that I was very sensitive. Also, you're hormonal and like you're getting fat, and like I was very sensitive during pregnancy. If a friend canceled plans on me, we all flake on each other all the time. It's like the New York way. And I've always loved friends who flake because it means I owe them a flake. But when I was pregnant, I would look so forward to seeing my girlfriends. And if somebody bailed, I was so hurt. I was like devastated. I really needed my friends and I still really need my friends.
Do you ever feel like the fact that you had a baby in a relatively unconventional way is a kind of boundary between you and other mothers, or even other people in general?
Like, I'm Jewish, and I'm not religious, but I'm very sort of like proud to be Jewish, and I'm kind of active in like various holidays and stuff. And I go to the Chabad in Dumbo, which is like super religious people, but Chabad's whole way is like to not be judgmental and be open and be kind to all. And when it came to my daughter's baby naming, in traditional Jewish ceremony, you say like daughter of, and you name the husband and the father and the woman. And they went out of their way during this baby naming to never make it an issue, to not even let me know that they rewrote, the prayers or whatever. They just made it so smooth and natural for for Hazel, my baby, to only have a mother. And it's like emotional to talk about. If this rabbi was okay with me having Hazel through this like completely unconventional way, through like modern medicine basically, and an anonymous sperm donor, like that was so touching to me. And maybe it's because that on a deeper level I feel like that means God is okay with it or whatever. Now I sound like this Orthodox Jewish woman from...
No, but you're saying if he was okay with it, then friends of yours should be okay with it. And if they're not, you were really prepared to weed whack,
Oh, totally. And I still am. It's like that It's that like mama bear roars. You can be like, I am alone a lot of the time without being lonely. Like just because you're alone.
And part of that is the way that you're wired, and part of it, I think, because you're decisive, you've almost been decisive about not allowing yourself to dip into that place when you feel it. So you don't.
Can you write that down for me so I can say it?
You don't entertain loneliness, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Loneliness is that person I blocked from Facebook. I think it really does come down to that relationship with yourself. I really do. And if you can nail that healthy relationship with yourself, it's really hard to be lonely, because when you have a chunk of time when no one's calling and no one's texting and no one gives a shit where you are, you can either look at that as like, wow, like I am unwanted in this world, or you can look at it as like this huge opportunity, like great, I can like go sit at Balthazar and have that like glass of champagne like that I haven't had the chance to do for so long, or I can dig into this book, or call that friend in San Francisco. You know, it's like, it's so how you choose to see these moments of isolation.
For more, head to thelonelyhour.com. This is The Lonely Hour, produced by Pale Groove. I'm your host, Julia Bainbridge. I'm an editor and a writer, mainly about food, but I also have a lot of feelings, loneliness being one of them. I want to explore that feeling because it's pervasive, but the literature on it is not. Each episode of The Lonely Hour is going to focus on a particular topic, whether it's a community or a profession, an age group, or an activity that seems to arouse feelings of loneliness or aloneness. That could be mental illness, for example, or it could be social media's effect on us. It could even be motherhood. The idea is to catalog tidbits on this very human feeling. Because we all feel lonely sometimes, I want to explore how we feel it. Over the last couple of years, OpenTable has seen a 62% increase in reservations for tables for one throughout the country. So is it because people like or are even growing to prefer dining alone, or is this just circumstance? In the case of food writer Jamie Feldmar, having lunch or dinner alone in restaurants can be a pleasurable thing, a way to recharge and enjoy just herself.
I wrote an article for Serious Eats a couple years ago called In Defense of Eating Alone, which was a personal manifesto all about the pleasures of dining for one. And I had a couple of points sort of ranging from the practical to the philosophical. So on a practical level, I occasionally enjoy eating by myself because it makes it easier to get into crowded restaurants. I can get whatever I want and not have to share it with anyone. I can get, those are sort of the practical reasons. And on a philosophical level, it really gives me a chance to have a little bit of a mental break and have a reset inside of my own head. My life and my work are very, very social and filled with a lot of stimulus and a lot of human interaction. And I love people, and I love having an active social life, and I love having an active professional life, and they bleed into each other, and that's really fulfilling for me. But it can be overwhelming, and I like spending a little bit of downtime, a little bit of quiet time in my own head where I can focus on the things that I sort of need to spend some time thinking about. I oftentimes come up with ideas for creative projects when I'm alone.
Including this article?
Including this article, which was written as a direct result of me going out to eat by myself. And, you know, it's a chance to be
really selfish, which is something that I am a strong advocate for, not all the time in life, but it's a time to do whatever you want to do and only you, and not have to compromise with other people and not have to go through this social negotiation of interacting with other people. And I actually find it incredibly not only pleasurable, but necessary for me to take a break from the sort of constant socialization and stimulus that I'm subject to in almost every other aspect of my life.
Yeah, and it seemed to resonate with readers. Like, they, in the comments of this piece, they overwhelmingly agreed, that they enjoy dining alone sometimes anyway. And as you said, not just as an escape from other stuff, but as a, as a real moment, as a gift to themselves.
Yeah, the same way I think that, the human body needs to sleep every night in order to restore itself physically. I think that occasionally the human brain needs some alone time to restore itself mentally. And if you're someone like me who loves to eat, it's great to combine that alone time with the activity of eating. And I don't necessarily, it's not for everyone. Like, if you don't want to do it or if you're not comfortable doing it, then don't. But my point is that there's no shame in it. There should be no stigma attached to it. And actually, I have found that if you want it to, it can be a way to encourage social interaction. I've had really good experiences dining alone, talking to waitstaff or bartenders who've paid extra attention to me or been extra nice to me. I've met new people when I'm dining alone at a bar who are also there dining alone for whatever reason, and sometimes we strike up a conversation, and that's nice. So it's not necessarily like an isolating thing.
In a change of format from how we usually do this show, another person joined in my conversation with Jamie. Kef is a video artist whose short film Party of One focuses on the downsides of dining alone. Before we get into kind of a counterpoint with Jamie, I'll let him tell you about that project and why he finds the rise in solo dining to be worrisome.
The short film is basically a narrative-driven piece, kind of examining the culture of eating alone. It's done through the eyes of an immigrant who has moved to New York City and is unfamiliar with kind of like the culture of eating alone that's really prevalent especially in urban cities like Los Angeles and New York. And the immigrant is Taiwanese and comes from a culture where eating is, I would argue, kind of really one of the basic tenets. Eating together is one of the basic tenets of day-to-day life, and it's highly prized and highly valued in that society.
Why shoot it through his eyes instead of somebody who maybe is more practiced and comfortable at this?
Well, I wanted to kind of remind people of that. I think for a lot of New Yorkers who've been here for a very long time, eating alone becomes you're accustomed to it. It's something that you see a lot of people doing. And the more time you spend in New York, the more time you spend eating alone, the less strange it seems. But then I think I wanted to use an immigrant's perspective to kind of not just create a stronger juxtaposition between kind of like his point of view and the environment he's in, but I also kind of wanted to remind people of how naturally we think eating alone, we start out thinking that eating alone is uncomfortable. I wanted to kind of like go back to the roots of that. And I think for a lot of people, seeing it, especially in places like LA and New York, and just for people who have kind of grown accustomed to eating alone, it had become unfamiliar to them. So I wanted to remind them.
All right, Kef, in an email you sent me before we got together here, you wrote that you were concerned that the joy of dining alone coupled with the waning taboo of it could lead to a preference for dining alone, and that this preference may ultimately have long-term costs in terms of human happiness and health. Can you expand on that?
I eat alone quite a lot, and I kind of wanted to do something about the subject for a while. I wasn't sure what my point of view on it was, but what really kind of shaped my opinion was when I read there's a great book by a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard called America. What he had done was that after he retired from teaching philosophy in France, he'd kind of come to America for the first time and just kind of wandered around. And at the end of it all, he kind of wrote down everything he observed and turned it into a book, which I thought was really, really like an interesting observation. But he had a nice piece within his thing about eating alone. And he said that eating alone is sadder than poverty and sadder than the beggar. He said that eating alone. He said that human beings and animals, when they're born, are either sharing in food or fighting over it. And he said that when someone chooses to eat alone, they're kind of foregoing their basic relationships to food, and in essence are dead, which is a little bit dramatic, certainly. But it was a very like interesting point of view that I thought about and like turned over in my head more and more.
Dramatic, but echoed by the subject of your film, because, correct me if I'm wrong, at one point he said, the more you eat alone, the more out of touch with humanity you'll become.
Right. And I think overall, as like technology seeped into our lives and stuff like that, I feel like people like civilization as a whole is kind of becoming, in a way, more like antisocial in a certain way. And I don't and it's interesting to me because it's often like skewed or presented as being like independent and empowering. And I saw this as another example of that, which is where eating alone and all that is being presented as this like empowering, liberating thing, where it can be. But I also wanted to take the devil's advocate point of view on that. And I think that the more you eat alone, the more you kind of want to, because naturally you feel uncomfortable with it. I think there's a bit of cognitive dissonance that kind of kicks in where you need to suppress that discomfort as much as possible. And while I'm saying there are true benefits to eating alone, I think you might convince yourself more and more that those benefits are are greater than they actually seem. Then all of a sudden eating alone is the best option.
I actually think that the bigger potential repercussion on culture as a whole is if you deny your desire to occasionally be alone and you force yourself into a position where you're constantly socializing and not being lonely, or you're trying very hard to avoid loneliness. I think that that's actually setting humans as a whole up for failure. Like, that's a high pressure situation that's unattainable, and I think it's very necessary for humans to occasionally take a break from socializing.
We kind of take like two different extremes on the same thing in a certain sense. You're afraid that, I mean, I totally get the sense that like eating alone, you're saying, is basically recharging in a sense, is recharging for like later like social interaction and stuff like that. And I'm coming from a different point of view, which is that I think people gravitate to what's comfortable. Mm-hmm. And I think while people naturally like it, and it's interesting because we've talked a lot about how eating together, I think, is a norm. But then I think that in this like culture where people are becoming more isolated, I think people are becoming more comfortable with being by themselves. So the thing is that I think that, and this is where the short-term and the long-term thing happens, I think that at some point many people start to transition from seeing eating alone as like a recharge from like social activity to a straight up preferred eating method.
And you think that that's gonna like destroy humanity?
I don't think it's
turn
necessarily
us all into zombies.
It's not going to destroy humanity necessarily, but it is going to lead to kind of it's a fundamental breakdown of one of the most human things we do, which is to eat together. By nature, I think like I maintain that all animals are natural, like by nature, social. So you have that fundamental element where people desire to be in the company of others. People want to do things with other people. People are happier when they're in contact with other people. Even there's been studies about people who have kind of gone freelance and how they've become lonelier because they don't have that everyday contact of just walking around people, or walking to an office and stuff like that. Yeah. So that's a nature element, which is that I think animals, human beings included, are by nature social. And then there's a nurture element of it, which is that historically, if you look at most cultures, they're built up in this culture of eating together. You have the Europeans who have you have the feast, and in modern times you have the Barcelona 3 to 4 hour midnight dinners where everyone kind of congregates together. In Asian culture, we're family, and family is essentially important, but eating together is so critical that one of the common greetings in Chinese is 你吃饭了没, which is have you eaten yet? That's how people just straight up greet each other.
But cultures evolve, though. I mean,
right.
Technology has evolved, and culture evolves along with it.
Mm-hmm.
So is it such a bad thing that perhaps humans are culturally evolving toward a more isolated eating experience?
I mean, that remains to be seen, right? I think I've certainly seen that happen. Not despite the sacredness of eating together in Asian culture. You eating alone very much does happen, especially in Tokyo, and I think that it has to do with urbanization to a certain
Yeah, and
extent.
there's obviously a lot of downsides to urbanization, but at the same time, it's not all evil. I mean, economy has flourished, technology has flourished. These things, it's hard to separate them.
Right.
I can't deny it, but it's not necessarily eroding. I don't think it's eroding fundamental human nature. It's just that human nature is changing and evolving along with all of these other things that we're creating around it. There was something you said in your email, and I'm just going to read it, about how loneliness is a reprieve from moments, a relief in between moments of social interaction. And I wanted to sort of know what you meant by that, because in the language that you used, the word relief almost made it seem like a positive thing, like loneliness could be a positive break from social interaction. And I just wanted to say that there's many times that I'm not necessarily socially interacting with anyone, but I'm also not lonely. I don't think that they go hand in hand.
You keep referring to communal dining as a fundamental thing we're kind of bred to do, but I don't know that that's true. I mean, we're eating alone from day one, right? Like a baby nurses on its own.
As long as you think that eating together with other people is the best version of or the best way to eat, I think eating alone is always going to be a little bit lonely.
There are many wonderful things about eating with other people, and I do think that you should do it often. I think it's very important for many, many reasons. But there is always an element of compromise, almost always an element of compromise that comes when you are interacting with other people, especially over food. You're negotiating what to order, you might be sharing food, you're dealing with people's dietary preferences, you're dealing with people's taste preferences. There's always a negotiation. And most of the time it's not a huge deal, and it's not insurmountable. But because most of us have to do a lot of negotiation all throughout our day with everything, not just with food. One of the nice things about eating alone that I think really comes back to one of the fundamentally great things about being human is that you can do whatever you want, and you can really indulge and engage in your most pure desires in a way. You can be 100% fully yourself doing whatever you want to do when you're not having to compromise with other people. So if I'm eating alone and I want to mix and match ice cream with Chinese food with a Polish dessert or some whatever, I can do that because I want to, and that to me is so necessary in a life filled with so many compromises every day.
Great when taken in small doses, but I think if I'm really to put it in a nutshell, what Kef is getting at is, and I stated this earlier, the question are our desires, always what's best for us, or satisfying those desires always the healthiest thing for us? And you keep saying doing what we want to do, it's leading. Doing what we want to do, meaning dining alone more. It's leading to this big preference for dining alone more. So we're all eating alone more, and ultimately we're becoming a lonelier people because though we've convinced ourselves we want to eat alone, it may not be the healthiest thing for us as a human people based on what you see in most cultural histories, right?
Well, I would argue that it's not healthy to deny In the same way that you sort of argue that it's not healthy to deny the natural discomfort of eating alone, I would say it's not healthy to deny the desire to occasionally eat alone.
Over the last 2 years, Open Table has seen like a 62% increase in tables for one throughout America. And I guess you could argue that, that's great because people who might have been denying their desire to eat alone before, becoming more comfortable with it and satisfying those desires, but perhaps, I guess your whole question, Kef, in this film is like perhaps this trend is increasing and increasing to a degree that it ultimately might be bad for us as a human people.
Yeah, and you say that like people should be free to do what they want. And free to,
I don't want to take this to the most extreme.
I'm totally not making. I'm not.
For the record, murder is bad.
Yeah, I'm not making this about a thing about liberty and stuff like that. I want to, we have the evidence. It's great that you brought that Open Table statistic. That eating alone is. I think that is an indication that it's become, in a lot of cases, already a preference, and so. Just as people occasionally have desires to want to eat alone, have a moment's break, we still have desires too to eat together. Like we want, like when the new restaurant opens, or when you want to get together with somebody, or something like that, or sometimes you just crave social contact.
Absolutely.
The problem is, in my opinion, that when you've become accustomed to eating alone, it's what you know so well, and it's what's so comfortable that becomes then the tables
you
are
choose
kind
that
of
over
precisely. So the tables are kind of turned in that sense, where you like what you really want is social contact, but it's so hard to go through your phone to get in touch with somebody. It's so hard to figure out where you want to go. There's so many compromises. So you've become so accustomed to you've already convinced yourself that the benefits there are so many benefits to eating alone. And without realizing you've already kind of preferred it, and it is the easier option. I can go get a burrito at my favorite place right now, and not have to wait like an hour for one of 3 people to text me back about food. And so in that context, then that's kind of like where, you can tell yourself that like you still got what you wanted in the end, but I feel like then that becomes harder to satisfy, because it's one thing. It's one thing to like to kind of be in a place where eating alone is still uncomfortable, but then to still occasionally crave eating alone, and that's an itch you can scratch, because that's a low cost of entry. There's just no barriers to that. You can just there's a little bit of discomfort, but you pull your phone out, you look at some stuff, you don't feel so weird by yourself. To go from the other way around, which is that you're used to eating alone, to going back to like, okay, I'm ready to go eat with friends again. That's a very difficult thing to go back. And I think it mirrors kind of dating in that sense. Like to go from like being the person who goes out Friday night, Saturday night, and being like, you know what, like I'm tired of meeting like really whack people. I'm tired of like spending like $40 on cabs and like buying drinks and stuff like that. Like I'm just gonna be like a Netflix kind of person. Like that's super easy. It's super easy to go for that. But to go from to become used to that, to becoming used to saving money, becoming used to like not having to wear makeup and like constantly like look your best and going like, okay, I gotta get out. Like once you've become like Netflixed, and I think now is I just made that a verb. And I think this, it's kind of like appropriate because we've got this winter, like right now, like is when people are staying in the most, like to try and go from that to like, okay, I'm going to dress up and go in. The barriers are like much, much higher. So it's the same thing of like, once you become accustomed to like being alone and doing your thing, it's so much harder to go back to that.
I think that's so, I totally hear you.
Yeah.
And I understand, and to a certain extent, I agree.
Uh-huh.
But I also think that there's like a level of assumption going on here that if you go too far down this road of liking to eat alone, like you can't go back, like you can't reintegrate into society. And I don't think there's really any evidence to support that.
Well, it's if you think eating alone is by nature like part of who, or if you think that like people are social, then eating alone is kind of like what, and even in that temporary reprieve, it's a severing from of yourself kind of from that. And so the question I'm raising is that, like, if you sever that cord repeatedly over time, can you rebuild it? And for a lot of, and so I think that for a lot of people, like, the answer is yes, because they've never, they haven't really like gotten to a place where they've become so accustomed to it so they can go back easily. But I know for a fact there are plenty of people who have become so used to it and have essentially cut the cord.
And they can't crawl back out of it.
I think it's very, very difficult for them to do.
I find myself more annoyed sometimes with dining with people now because there are so many comforts that come
You've
from
gone
dining
to
alone.
the dark side.
There are times when I'm eating alone where I like to be social too. Like, I like to strike up conversations with other people and stuff like that.
Right, we haven't even really talked about that. Yeah.
So there was a woman I'd met. She had been widowed for 15 years, and she was just eating, and she had, like, as a result, she'd become used to eating alone. And she straight up told me when I tried to strike up a conversation with her that she didn't like talking to people anymore. That this was her thing. She had accepted that was the way it was, and so for her, like, it was all she knew.
First-time novelist Stephanie Danler wrote a book called Sweet Bitter about her experience as a waitress at, what was it, Union Square Cafe? Yeah. And she references this one woman who's a widow. She lives alone now, no husband. Her kids are grown and have their own families wherever they are. And her weekly tradition is to come into the restaurant, and that's where she has contact. She knows all of the servers by name. They treat her well. She treats them well. It's this real dining solo for her is this real way to get in touch with other people.
It's highly personal. It's highly personalized. It has a lot to do with what kind of person you are and what you do for a living and, how you like to interact with other people or not interact with other people. Mm-hmm. It's hard to make generalizations about it. I know we've sort of spent the past hour doing just that, but it is worth it to realize that people eat alone for all kinds of different reasons. Lots of people eat alone because of work, because they travel for their jobs and they travel independently and they have no one to eat with. So they're sort of forced to. And maybe they end up liking it or maybe they don't. I will admit that when I eat alone, it's typically at a place with a bar where where it doesn't seem as obvious to be eating alone. However, I distinctly recall a couple years ago, I took myself to lunch at a restaurant called Perry Street that no longer exists, but it's like a John George restaurant, fairly high end. And I went alone and sat at a table by myself and brought a book, and they were great about it. And I felt about 85% comfortable. But I will admit that there was a part of me that felt self-conscious about it because I was so obviously at a table for two, and it was just me. And that was a little bit hard, but I'm glad I did it, and I would do it again. But then we'd get to the issue of the book, which is also a defense mechanism slash potentially, a boredom mechanism. Sometimes you just want to go be alone and be inside of your own head. Sometimes you want maybe something to bring you out of your head. Sometimes maybe you just don't really want to think at all, so you're going to put something in front of you and have that there, and it's either for you to focus on or maybe it's to serve as a shield.
It can be both.
Part of the discomfort personally when I'm dining alone at a two-top as opposed to at a bar is because of the either the potential or the actual pity that's thrown my way from the wait staff. So, that's a whole nother issue, is that I would be 100% comfortable were I not receiving more attention very clearly from the wait staff.
It's obviously case by case and it's tough to say, and I think that depending on where you're eating and depending on how well trained the staff is, that there is sort of a right way to handle it, and it's you have to read, like, it's the waitstaff's responsibility to read the situation. I think some solo diners want extra attention and they sort of want to be coddled, and some don't want it, and it's like the onus is on the waitstaff. And whatever the diner is feeling, like if you're feeling that you're getting extra attention because you're alone, it's possible that that is the case. It's also possible that that's just an amplification of your own insecurity about being alone.
That's the construct, and that's the rules of society right now. Eating alone is weird. The society has kind of built it up, and the fact that you feel a little bit of discomfort eating alone is an indication that society has conditioned you to believe that eating together is the norm.
So I guess my whole point is like that eating alone is not necessarily lonely. It can be, but it is not the same.
Amanda Cohen is the chef and owner of Dirt Candy Restaurant in New York City. From this February 9th to 13th, she's not only reserving all of her counter seats for solo diners, but she's also created a special tasting menu just for them.
And we like doing these nights because we get a lot of single diners, just even throughout the year, not even around Valentine's Day. And it does suck because they come in and they have like one thing and they're like, oh, I wish I could have so much. And at the little place, we had time to say, oh, well, we'll split orders for you. We'll do what we can. But here we're a little bit busy, or it's a little bit more complicated. And this seemed like a really nice thing we could do where you could sit down by yourself and actually have a whole adult meal and not feel rushed. I feel like often when you go out as a single diner, solo diner, the restaurants tend to make you feel uncomfortable, like you're taking up space. And you shouldn't be there for that long because they could take that table and give it to two people. And we really want to let people know, no, you're here. We are going to let you sit for as long as you want to sit. Take your time, enjoy it, have a really good conversation with yourself. I love my solo diners. They're usually the nicest customers. They come in, they're not grumpy, they're really excited to be here. In general, they tend to be more sort of like destination diners. That's what I've discovered. You're out of town and you're like, well, what am I going to do tonight? I don't know anybody in this city. And so then you make a reservation and you go spend the night at a restaurant. So yeah, I love it. Absolutely. Yeah. And I've almost never had a solo diner not show up for their reservation. So that's a plus.
What about staff training? Like, do you focus on teaching the wait staff anything about especially dealing expertly with solo diners, or is it kind of like the same rules apply to everyone?
I think the same rules apply, but we do talk about, going a little bit slower. They don't need to be hurried, or to watching them a little bit more, because the timing, I guess, the timing of how a solo diner eats is different than how two people eat. They could actually be going faster, they could be going slower. So you do have to sort of focus a little bit more and work with their rhythm. We want to make sure they're really happy. So whereas sometimes with tables of two, we can impose our rhythm, with a single diner, we can't. They can't be eating here a lot of our courses are shared. It's a couple of different plates and they're all shared. So, but here we want to be really careful that we don't give them too much at once, or we only give them one at once, because it's too overwhelming. You're sitting at a table and you're like, well, I ordered 4 dishes, but I didn't necessarily want them all at once. Whereas for a table of 2, that's what we would do, because, that's how we send out the food.
Are you noticing a shift in the industry at all, like that with more people dining alone? Hospitality is accommodating them differently, or, putting more attention on how to treat the solo diner, or even on building out new restaurants with solo diners in mind, like more, longer, deeper bars, or...
Well, I think just sort of so many restaurants now do have counter seating, or they do have bigger bars. And that sort of makes it so much easier for solo diners. So I think that does become a consideration. I think for other people, it is hard to, have a solo diner come in and take up 2 seats. That is real estate.
Right.
But the more you can sort of sit at a bar or sit at a counter, it makes it really easy. So, and it's not, maybe 10 years ago it would have been weird. And now it's pretty normal to look over and see some single person eating next to you.
Yeah. Do you like dining solo? Do you do it yourself?
I would. I'm not often by myself, but I think I would. I'd go to my own solo diners. I mean, I wouldn't go to my restaurant because that'd be weird. But yeah, I think it would be great. And I think if you can go to a restaurant where you're going to feel comfortable, it makes it that much easier. So, if you're traveling and, a restaurant sort of has a program for a solo diner, then yeah, I mean, I would go there in a heartbeat. It is awkward sometimes walking into a restaurant and being like, can I just sit at the bar by myself and have something to eat? You do feel weird. It's already awkward enough going into a restaurant. So being by yourself is even a little bit more awkward. But if you are going somewhere that's accommodating, it makes it that much nicer.
Why do you say that going into a restaurant is already kind of awkward?
I don't know. Even though I own one and I've owned some, you get intimidated. You walk in and you have to deal with the hostess and you have to wait at the bar and you have to get people's attention and you have to make sure the server likes you. I don't know. I think I'm performative, so I always want to make sure, a server is like, yeah, you're funny, of course, whatever. Or I'm doing the right thing, or I'm cool enough to be in the restaurant. I always think of myself as a giant dork. So am I like the biggest dork in the restaurant at that moment?
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way, but there is that. Immediately you cross the threshold of the restaurant, and kind of because it's the hospitality industry, eyes are kind of on you, at least from behind the hostess table, and maybe other waiters looking up to see who's the new customer who walked in the door. It's like there's a little bit of a spotlight on you.
There is, and are they going to talk about me? Are they going to talk about what I ordered? Did I order too much?
Do you know that from personal experience? Do you guys talk about diners? Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is we never talk about diners that order too much food because, that's awesome. We do sometimes, or like, oh, you only ordered that much? That's what the back whispering is about. So, but in my head as a diner, I always think they're going to talk about how much I ordered. But, that's my job. So we order a lot of food. And I apologize. I'm like, oh, I know we ordered a lot, but I'm really hungry today. Or, whatever stupid thing it is I say. Because you feel awkward as opposed to being like, well, I'm at a restaurant. I'm ordering food. What do you care? Even I know that the conversation isn't that I order too much. It's, wow, they didn't order enough.
Right. I like the way you put it with the solo dining program because, it's more than just reserving seats. It's also, as you're doing, creating something special just for solo diners. Do you know of anyone else doing this sort of thing? Any other restaurants?
Yet.
Yeah, I mean.
Not yet, but I hope it takes off. And the response was always really good at the little one. We had sort of this core group that came back year after year. But it's been outstanding this time around and surprising. So maybe people will take note and, this is actually a program that'll take off. One of the fun things, too, is, we do have this sort of core group who's come year after year. And there might not be friends outside of the restaurant, but they do see each other when they come into the restaurant. And they're like, hey, haven't seen you for a year. How's it going?
What about the most private kind of dining? Alone and at home? Samantha Rose Witter just finished a master's in food studies at New York University, where she completed a project that studied the human emotions connected to this kind of solo meal taking. She called it bed spaghetti.
I eat alone a lot, which is what led me to this project. I wanted to keep with that projection of self and performance of identity. And I thought you can boil it down really easily to what you are when you eat alone, what that says about you. So there was a moment when I was, I think, deciding on what I wanted to do. I was eating a bowl of spaghetti in bed. I had stripped my bed of all the sheets. It was laundry day, and it was just a bare mattress and a bowl of leftover spaghetti that was gummy and pretty disgusting. And I thought to myself, if someone could see me now, what would they think? What does this say about me? Should I be guilty? Should I feel embarrassment and shame about this meal, or should I just feel fine? And I started to think, what do other people eat alone? This is such a common thing. Everyone eats alone. There's no instance that I know of where someone has not had this experience of eating solo. So I decided to title it Bed Spaghetti.
Awesome.
These stories are really important. They are poignant and powerful, and everyone has one. So I just created an open-ended survey, and I just tried to get as many responses as possible. And those responses were so beautiful that I felt I just needed a place to put them. And reading through them, the quotes were just visual to me. I thought they were stimulating visually. So I created a photo essay and attached these quotes to them.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about, or ask you about something that I saw you write on the site. So it's bedspaghetti.com. you wrote that after conducting some research, or I guess those surveys, that you found that, quote, meals eaten in this solitary manner are deeply rooted not just in pleasure and delight, as I had initially expected when I started this project, but also in guilt, shame, self-consciousness, anger, and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll get to the loneliness in a sec, since that's what we're concerned with here. But why did you expect pleasure and delight?
I think because I feel that. When
Yeah.
I'm eating something, I am so excited to just binge. I love that no one will watch me. I can eat with my hands. I don't have to use a napkin. I can eat the crumbs on the table and not feel like, oh, someone's going to look at me and think that table's dirty. Why are you eating that? I ate an entire sleeve of cookies yesterday in front of the computer. And when my husband came home, he saw the empty package and he said, oh, I saw you were eating cookies. And I'm like, yeah, I was. It was great. So I feel
This is why I'm never getting married. There'll be nobody to watch, to call me on that kind of behavior.
You don't want to be called out. And you're like, oh, I did do that. That's right. I mean, I get a lot of pleasure from eating. I feel a lot of pleasure eating processed food. I think a lot of people don't. I'm an anomaly in that sense, at least in the program I was in.
Definitely. I mean, I would imagine that.
Yeah.
Is there some shame involved in that?
Oh,
So it's like that's your private
100%.
moment when you can delight in it.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
a bag of flaming hot Cheetos to me is just ecstasy. So I was expecting this sense of delight,
Yeah.
and instead I received a lot of guilt and shame, and it was enlightening to me. It definitely opened my eyes. It made a lot of sense also. I mean, there are a lot of people who have food issues and eating alone. If you have a food issue, if you're alone with yourself, then of course that's going to be amplified. It's just you and the plate and the food. You're not going to necessarily have anything else holding you back or telling you to do something. So I was surprised, but in a expected way, I guess. It was yeah. Reading through them, and some of my favorite pieces just kind of had that a tone, a very specific feeling. So things like anxiety, there was one quote, I'm not even sure if this is the same category, but a story about how someone felt fear of choking when they eat alone. So they would exclusively eat mushy food alone. And or if they weren't eating mushy food, they would have a phone near them so they could call someone if there was an issue.
Wow.
Which to me was wild. I had never even considered that. This person, I think it was a man, but I'm not sure, who had very poor written skills and wrote all about how they used to eat poorly, used to eat processed food. Now they're starting to try to change the way in which they eat, and they're trying to eat more frozen food that's packaged, but with fresher ingredients, etc. And at the end of this, and they started to write about how they eat when they're alone. And this person would say, I don't want to watch TV, but I always find myself doing that because, and the last sentence was something like, I don't have nobody to eat with. And it was just so, I mean, all of these quotes, kind of the last bit of it is the crux of it, I think. A lot of people just kind of would write their thoughts, and then at the end of it they would say their statement, which to me a lot of it was loneliness. There was someone who wrote about how they will make like hot dogs and mac and cheese for themselves, and they said if I was with someone else I would probably eat better, and I would probably not watch TV, or I would try to do something else, but I'm alone in this, so this is what I eat. There are times when I eat alone and I know if someone else was there, maybe I would make something healthier. But I mean, for me, it's convenience most of the time. And because of convenience, that's why my tastes are swayed towards processed food anyway. I mean, I was raised in a household in which convenience was a necessity, so therefore we ate processed food. And if I'm alone, I would prefer to eat something processed. It'll be quick, it'll be easy, it'll be satisfying. But if I'm with someone else, maybe I want to make sure that person feels cared for, and that they're, I'm not just throwing Kraft mac and cheese in their face and calling it a meal. Instead, I'm going to make them something fresh and healthy. But
so true. Like, we care for others better than we care for ourselves a lot of the time.
A lot of people said that.
Yeah.
So many people harped on that, which I was surprised about. I thought
how so? What'd they say?
A lot of people would say that if they were alone, they wouldn't even make themselves a meal. It could be just snacks or things straight out of the refrigerator or pantry or boxes, and not a full meal at all.
Yeah.
And they said if someone else was there, they would probably put the time and effort into making a meal. But if it's just for them, they didn't say they're not worthy, but that's the quality that I felt reading those statements.
One I found hilarious was in the satisfied category, and this person wrote, "There was a woman who lived across the street from me alone, and I would watch her rituals which paralleled mine, and I spotted her on her little balcony dining on salmon for one. It was a good recipe, but instructed to sear the skin and slip it off. I say live a little." I mean, only in New York, right? Like, these people are alone together and spying on each other alone.
No, watching across the balcony, watching a paralleled experience. I had to really sift to find the things that were, those joyous moments. There's one in which someone is writing about breakfast that they eat, and they'll make it themselves and eat it in bed. And it's this, I think she says it's like a hell yeah, I got this feeling. Those were so rare and so sad to me, because this is something that we all do. We all eat alone, and yet we're all sitting here alone in our homes feeling this guilt and shame, or not all of us, but a handful of us are all just kind of tortured by that. And I do think, I don't know how to make it emotionally, and I guess I have to just let it be and just have the quality that it needs to have. But I think it is unfortunately something that is painful for a lot of people and difficult.
Like, is this a growing phenomenon? Like, we keep saying it is a thing, so feel less bad about it. But is it a thing more than it used to be a thing?
I think it's a thing that we're at least addressing now, or we're at least talking about. Only maybe just earlier this week, there was an article published, I don't even remember where, but it was about how those who eat alone on a regular basis, or I think it's those who live alone, are eating unhealthy compared to those who live with others and are eating meals with others. So I think that...
Like nutritionally?
Nutritionally, which was fascinating to me. And I think that we're just now addressing that it's a thing that we're doing. It's a thing that people are... I think we've probably been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
I think it's a city thing, too. I think it has a lot to do with living in cities.
Yeah.
But who doesn't eat a meal alone? I mean, that's... In the modern era, who's not rushing out the door and snacking, it's just so common to me that even if you're in your car, you may be eating alone. And yes, you're in that like transitional space between home and work or somewhere else, but I do think that there are these kind of bubbles in which we are doing this, and it's a regular thing that's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree that hopefully on the sort of individual level, the shame ultimately, washes away from it. But when I think about it large, kind of the impact of, as we said, in the modern era, more people eating alone, I wonder about the impact of that on our emotional health. And I guess you're seeing articles reporting on the physical health of it even, because in company you kind of have those checks and balances. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of being alone is that you can do whatever the hell you want. But the potential, like, that there's something bad in that too. I mean, you could just run away. We don't always make the best decisions for ourselves, So,
right.
As you pointed out, with like the hot dogs and the mac and cheese, and
or even when we're not making those decisions for ourselves, and we feel alone, that guilt is coming from that third party, which is society and our psyche, and that other thing that's kind of always on our shoulders saying something. So although we are utterly, completely alone eating the food, and we're making those decisions as that person alone, we're still going to have that guilt and shame kind of no matter what, as long as there's that voice in our head.
For more, head to thelonelyhour.com. This is The Lonely Hour, produced by Pale Groove. I'm your host, Julia Bainbridge. I'm an editor and a writer, mainly about food, but I also have a lot of feelings, loneliness being one of them. I want to explore that feeling because it's pervasive, but the literature on it is not. Each episode of The Lonely Hour is going to focus on a particular topic, whether it's a community or a profession, an age group, or an activity that seems to arouse feelings of loneliness or aloneness. That could be mental illness, for example, or it could be social media's effect on us. It could even be motherhood. The idea is to catalog tidbits on this very human feeling. Because we all feel lonely sometimes, I want to explore how we feel it. The greatest aims of literature were, according to the late David Foster Wallace, to connect, to challenge, and to make us feel less alone. The act of writing, though, is a solitary one. Thus, a career as a writer involves a lot of time spent alone. As another great writer, Ernest Hemingway, said at his Nobel banquet speech in 1954, writing, at its best, is a lonely life. Will Chancellor's first novel, A Brave Man 7 Stories Tall, was published in 2014, and he's currently in the middle of writing his second, called To Test the Meaning of Certain Dreams.
When I first wrote this, the book that came out in 2014, I was living in Pittsburgh, Texas, this little town in northeast Texas. My grandmother, my mom grew up in this town, and my grandmother had a house, but she was in assisted living, but we kept her place in Pittsburgh, Texas, right? Mm-hmm. So it was this house that no one had lived in something like 7 years, and it was run down in the middle of the woods in northeast Texas, and I went there for 8 months, and I was living, completely by myself. I would go to the grocery store in the middle of the night. There was a Piggly Wiggly that was open until like 10 p.m. and I would go at like 9:30 so I wouldn't see anyone, and I would just...
So you wouldn't see anyone?
Right, yeah. I mean, I just didn't have... And I would stock up on... Basically get like a month's worth of supplies. So I would get Newman's Saccaroni sauce and spaghetti and then mac and cheese and almond milk. And then I would go home with like a month's worth of supplies, and I would just stay... I was in this house... There was no one that I knew in the town. I had there was an old rotary phone with a rotary dial. And I would talk on the phone to my parents every week or so. But I mean, I was really, really cut off. And
intentionally so. I mean, you went to the grocery store late so that you wouldn't see anyone.
I mean,
why?
I was 22 years old, and I was really hard about what I thought my view of the world was, which is hilarious now. But like, I was just like, look, I'm going to write this book, and I need complete, I need to be cut off in order to do it. And the upshot of this is I've never been happier in my life.
When you were in that house in
which makes
Pittsburgh,
me
Texas, which I didn't know existed. I was like, Pittsburgh, Texas? Is that a typo in the email he sent me?
Northeast Texas, yeah. And I mean, like, maybe that makes me a huge asshole, or maybe it makes me, I don't know what, but like, I've never been happier in my life than I was then. And part of that is like when you're in that crystallization phase where things are just like lining up, and it's kind of close to The Shining, I guess, in some ways, but like, I guess it's close because then when you move out of that state of isolation and you see what you have in relief against a regular world, you realize that it's actually pretty bad. And that's what happened to me. So I wrote this 1,200 page draft in 8 months of total like shut down isolation in Northeast Texas. And then I moved to New York, and I managed to get a spot in the Chelsea Hotel. So I was living there from 2004 to 2006. Mm-hmm. And I think being in the heart of Manhattan, mm-hmm. and in really a creative center of Manhattan, and being around a lot of people who lived in the hotel who were photographers and painters and writers, really made me look at the work differently, you know, and I looked at what I had in a more objective sense and realized that what I wrote in that cabin or in that house was horrible. And it was really, really bad. And eventually I got to a point where I just completely started over again. So I discarded that draft and began on page 1 again. I think initially I did need to go through that isolation in order to get to the point where I am now, where I can be, you know, amidst everything, but also kind of cut off in my own way.
Let's talk about the first book. Because I haven't gotten to that yet, so it's A Brave Man, 7 Stories Tall. And I haven't read it yet. I will now. But according to Flavor Wire, it's a book about people who have had their hearts broken in different ways and what becomes of them as they run away to deal with their grief. Is this, you think, an accurate way to describe what it's about?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's a story of, the title is meant to be playing around with the notion of what it means to be like epic and you know, and a lot of these notions that you form in your own head about the significance of your life, but then what ends up being the significant part of your life, I think, is your relationships and a lot of times, you know, heartbreak and trying to integrate that with these notions that you have of yourself as being like a brave man 7 stories tall, which, you know, isn't really meant to be that ironic. But yeah, I do think that that's an accurate description. I think it's how we come to terms with reality, specifically, you know, romantic reality, when we look at ourselves in this, you know, in this grander way, I guess, or in this bigger scheme.
Right. Well, so the main character,